good evening, or whatever word we use for the hours when the world forgets to breathe. If you're hearing my voice right now, it means you've wandered back into this small corner of the night, the place where stories don't need to shout to be frightening, and where the quiet things you try to ignore finally learn to speak. Tonight, I've prepared something different for you. 5 stories. 5 threads pulled from the darker seams of the world. Not loud horrors, no, nothing chasing you through the woods or waiting behind a locked door. These are the softer ones. The patient ones. The horrors that sit down beside you, fold their hands, and whisper your name like an old friend. Each story begins the same way most nightmares do. With a choice that feels harmless at first. A mirror polished too brightly. A garden that grows where no roots should survive. A tree that listens when you call its name. A portrait painted with more love than its canvas can contain. A face borrowed from someone who never agreed to lend it. If any of these things sound familiar, you might already know how this night ends. But don't worry. For the next few hours, all you need to do is listen. Let the world dim around you. Let the rhythm of your breath settle. And let these stories pull you gently, very gently, into the places just outside the reach of light. Welcome, insomniac. Welcome, wanderer. Welcome, to the hours that don't belong today. Now, close your eyes. And let the first story begin. Story 1. Ethan Ward always believed New York rewarded those who refused to blink, people who kept their eyes open long enough, wide enough, hungry enough to catch opportunities others overlooked, and on the late October evening when everything began, he told himself he was merely staying true to that philosophy as he wandered through a narrow, almost forgotten street south of Soho, the kind of place where the neon died out early and the puddles reflected buildings the city had torn down decades ago. He had left another failed pitch meeting an hour earlier, his portfolio still warm from his grip, his throat still tight with the polite, measured dismissals of developers who used words like promising and, perhaps in a few years, the way surgeons used anesthetics, gently, clinically, and with the precise amount needed to numb the pain without healing it. The failure left him walking without direction, past closed cafes and shuttered bookstores, past iron gates tangled with ivy, past the place where the street lamps flickered like hesitant thoughts, and though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, he was chasing something, some sign that the years he'd sacrificed weren't going to dissolve into nothing. That was when he saw it, a storefront so thin and crooked that at first he thought it was a maintenance door or emergency exit, but the faint yellow glow behind its dusty windows hinted at depth, at silence, at objects waiting to be chosen. The name above the lintel was barely legible, letters carved into old wood, half swallowed by the grain, but the shape of them suggested age, perhaps European, maybe French or Italian, the kind of place that didn't need customers because destiny was enough to keep the lights on. Ethan hesitated only as long as it took to register the smell drifting out from the half-open door, something like polished wood and old incense and the faint chill of a cathedral. Inside, the air felt warmer, yet unnaturally still, as though the room had been sealed off from drafts, footsteps, even time. Furniture sprawled in disordered elegance, mahogany desks with clawed feet, tarnished brass lamps, shelves cluttered with porcelain figurines whose painted eyes glimmered as if caught mid-blink, and somewhere deeper in the shop, an old clock ticked in slow, uneven beats, like a heart unsure whether to continue. Ethan almost turned back. He wasn't sure why he'd entered, and the strangeness of the shop pressed on his nerves like a whisper he wasn't ready to hear. But then his eyes caught something he would describe later, in the rare moments he allowed himself to remember that night, as a gleam too deliberate to be accidental. It shone from a tall, narrow object partly hidden between 2 wardrobes, an antique mirror framed in gold so bright he wondered if someone had polished it moments ago. The frame was carved with curling leaves, its edges subtly warped, as if shaped by hands that worked under candlelight. But it was the mirror's surface that drew him closer. It didn't just reflect, it shimmered, like a still pond under moonlight, mirroring the world not as it was but as it might become. And in that moment, as he stepped closer, he swore he saw something impossible. Behind his reflection, pale under the dim lights, shoulders slumped, tie loosened, stood the outline of a building he recognized. Not recognized, exactly. Imagined. A design he had sketched months ago. A design no one else had seen. He blinked, leaned closer, felt a sudden pressure behind his eyes like someone gently pressing 2 fingers against his temples. The image faded. The mirror returned to normal, or what passed for normal. Ethan's breath trembled slightly. Interested in that one? The voice came from behind him, soft but somehow carrying through the thick air. Ethan turned and saw the shopkeeper, an old man with an expression that seemed carved into place, as though he'd been carved from the same wood as the counters he leaned on. His eyes were sharp and dark, gleaming with a kind of amusement. Ethan managed a polite smile and gestured toward the mirror. "What's special about it?" "Special?" The old man tilted his head. "Everything and nothing. Most people don't notice it." He said this last part while studying Ethan, as if gauging why he had noticed it. A quiet unease slid along Ethan's spine. He didn't like being read, not tonight, not when vulnerability felt like an open wound. "How much?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The old man smiled. "Not as much as it's worth. But more than you think you should pay." Ethan waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. The silence stretched until Ethan felt compelled to step closer to the counter, reaching for his wallet before realizing he had no idea what he was offering to buy. "Can I?" he began, turning toward the mirror again. "Try it?" It was a foolish question, he knew. Who tries a mirror? But something in him needed to look again, needed to confirm he hadn't imagined the phantom building. The old man nodded once. That was all. Ethan found himself standing directly in front of the mirror, close enough that he could see the faint vein running across the bridge of his nose, the subtle exhaustion around his eyes. He waited. Nothing happened. And then the mirror dimmed, only slightly, but enough that the shop's warm glow pulled away from him. His reflection sharpened, the background blurred, and for a heartbeat he saw himself not as he was but as he wanted to be, confident, successful, the city behind him bending to his ambition. In that reflection, he stood taller. The suit fit better. His eyes glimmered with purpose. His designs, not on paper but real buildings, rose behind him like monuments to an unseen triumph. The image lasted maybe 2 seconds. Maybe less. But it filled him with an ache so sudden and so deep he thought it might split him open. When the mirror returned to its normal sheen, Ethan's breath left him in a shaky exhale. "What was that?" he whispered. "A glimpse," the old man said, "of potential." Ethan swallowed hard. "Is it real?" "Everything reflected is real," the old man replied. "Some things simply haven't happened yet." Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. His rational mind scrambled for explanations, psychological projection, lighting effects, any of the rehearsed reasons he'd used over the years when clients questioned unusual optical illusions. But none of those explanations matched the sensation still lingering in his chest, the strange certainty that the mirror had shown him not a fantasy but a promise. "How much?" Ethan repeated, more urgently this time. The old man named a price that should have made him laugh or walk out. Instead, Ethan nodded, barely hearing himself agree. He paid. He didn't remember taking out the money, didn't remember the old man wrapping the mirror in layers of soft, aging fabric. He only remembered carrying it out of the shop, a burden heavier than its physical weight, and the old man's last words drifting after him as the door creaked shut, "Be careful what you let it show you." Outside, the wind cut cold against his cheeks. The city resumed its usual sounds, distant traffic, a passing siren, the murmuring shuffle of people heading home, yet everything felt distorted, as if he had stepped out of one world and into another. He walked back to his apartment with the mirror pressed against him, its gilded frame digging gently into his ribs with each stride. Every so often he felt it vibrate, or perhaps it was his own heartbeat echoing through the glass, but he didn't dare unwrap it on the street. Only when he reached his building, climbed the 4 flights of stairs to his modest loft, and set the mirror carefully against the far wall did he allow himself to breathe again. His apartment was small, just large enough for his drafting desk, a kitchenette, and a bed tucked under a row of windows overlooking the alley. But the mirror, even in its wrappings, seemed to claim more space than its dimensions allowed, as though its presence shifted the air itself. He unwrapped it slowly, cautious not to scratch the frame. When the last layer fell away, the mirror caught the dim glow of the single lamp and sent a warm shimmer across the room. Ethan stared at his reflection, just his reflection, nothing more, and felt a strange, impossible hope swell inside him, a hope he'd been starved of for too long. He reached up to touch the frame. His fingers brushed the gilded leaves. And ever so faintly he thought he'd imagined it, the surface of the mirror rippled beneath his reflection, like something just beneath the glass had stirred in response. For 3 days, Ethan avoided the mirror, not because he feared it, he told himself, but because something about that first glimpse of his imagined success lingered in his mind like a half-remembered dream, too precious and too fragile to disturb. He found himself glancing toward the gilded frame every time he crossed his living room, not directly, but from the corner of his eye, the way someone might watch for distant lightning without wanting to acknowledge the storm, and whenever the light touched the surface of the glass he felt a quiet stirring inside his chest, a mixture of longing and unease that seemed to tug him closer even when he kept walking. The nights were worse. Lying in bed, listening to the muted hum of the city outside, he swore he could feel the mirror watching him, an absurd thought, yet it pressed against him like faint warmth through thick fabric, an invitation he tried to ignore. By the 4th night, after hours staring at the ceiling and wrestling with his own thoughts, ambition tightening in his chest like a fist, he got up and crossed the room barefoot, the floor cool beneath his feet, the air holding that familiar late autumn stillness. He stopped in front of the mirror, studying the surface, waiting for something, though he wasn't sure what. His reflection stared back, the exhaustion under his eyes, the faint stubble along his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. Nothing unusual. Nothing supernatural. And yet when he leaned closer, the glass dimmed again, subtly, like before, and he felt the same pressure behind his temples, a gentle but insistent push that urged his gaze deeper into the shimmering surface. The room blurred around him, fading like ink washed from parchment, and suddenly he wasn't looking at himself anymore but at a blueprint, no, a building, forming within the depths of the glass, as though sketched by an invisible hand. Tall. Asymmetrical, its facade woven from steel ribs that curved like the spine of a living creature. He recognized the design concept instantly. It was one of his more daring drafts, one he had abandoned months ago, convinced no developer would ever take the risk. But in the mirror, the structure was complete, real, standing over a skyline that looked unmistakably like New York's Upper West Side. He drew closer, barely breathing. The mirror's vision sharpened, sunlight glinting off metal, the shadow of the building stretching across a plaza, people stopping to stare at its impossible angles. And in the center of the plaza, a plaque bearing his name. Ethan Ward. Lead architect. The sight hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened, his hands tingled with that strange electric anticipation he hadn't felt since his final year of graduate school, when he believed, truly believed, that the world would recognize his talent. This is what it could be, he whispered to himself, though he didn't know if he meant the building or the life he imagined living beside it. The mirror pulsed, just once, a shimmer like breath across the glass. And then the vision faded. The room returned, grainy around the edges, as though it had been reassembled imperfectly. Ethan blinked, dazed. The sense of loss when the image vanished felt irrationally sharp, like being wrenched from warmth into cold. Show it again, he breathed, leaning forward, but the mirror remained still, its surface flat and unresponsive, offering only his reflection. His heart pounded. He lifted a hand, brushing the gilded frame lightly. The glass rippled beneath his touch, soft as water for the briefest second. He jerked back in shock, his breath catching. And then he saw it, something wrong, so subtle he didn't notice at first. His reflection blinked, but the movement looked off. Delayed. He leaned in closer. And closer. And suddenly he understood what had changed. His pupils, his reflection's pupils, were gone. The irises remained, but the centers were hollow, blank, like polished stone. What the hell, Ethan whispered, instinctively stepping back, yet unable to tear his gaze away from the empty-eyed version of himself staring out of the mirror. He reached up to touch his face. His fingers found eyelids, lashes, the roundness of his pupils exactly where they should be. He could see normally. The room looked normal. But the reflection was wrong. Panic fluttered in his chest, small and frantic, though he tried to suppress it. "It's a trick of the light," he muttered, even as he felt a tremor ripple through the surface of the glass. "A shadow or something. I'm tired. That's all." But the words sounded childish, like excuses made in the dark by someone trying to reassure themselves that monsters weren't real. He forced himself to look away, but as he turned, he caught another flicker in the mirror, movement, slight and urgent. When he turned back fully, the pupils had returned. Perfectly normal. Perfectly round. Perfectly human. The relief washed through him so quickly he nearly laughed aloud, but the laughter died before it reached his throat. Because the reflection's pupils hadn't returned gradually, or dimly, or as though they'd been obscured by some optical flaw, they had simply appeared, snapped into place, like someone flipping a switch. Ethan stood motionless, his fingers curling against his palms. The mirror no longer felt passive. It felt aware. Watching him. Waiting. But waiting for what? He took a step back, then another. And with distance came clarity. Fear was trying to climb into him, to gnaw at the edges of reason, but his ambition pushed back just as fiercely. Nothing great comes without cost, he reminded himself, the same mantra he'd used through sleepless nights and unpaid internships and competitions lost by 1 point. Maybe the mirror was dangerous. Or maybe, just maybe, the mirror was a door. A door he had already opened. A door he could not afford to close. For the next several days, he used it cautiously. Each night, when the city quieted and the glow of apartment windows softened into smudges of amber light, he stood before the mirror and waited for it to show him something. And it always did. Sometimes it revealed a fully formed idea for a new design, a tower twisting like a rope of braided glass, a museum shaped like a collapsed wave, a bridge that looked suspended from light rather than cable. Other times it showed him pieces, fragments of doors, staircases, facades, impossible lines drawn with extraordinary precision, leaving him to assemble the concept himself. And the visions were always beautiful. Beautiful and seductive. He filled sketchbook after sketchbook, sometimes working until dawn before realizing how much time had passed. The mirror never spoke. But it guided. And each time he looked, he felt a faint tug somewhere deep inside him, a pulling sensation he could never quite locate, like a thread tied to something behind his ribs, drawing him closer to the glass. It wasn't until the 7th night that things changed. Ethan had just finished dinner, the kind of tasteless, hurried meal eaten out of obligation rather than hunger, and he stood before the mirror with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. A developer had contacted him earlier that afternoon after seeing one of his newly polished concept models online. It was only a preliminary inquiry, but the tone of the email suggested real interest, a shift in luck he hadn't expected but embraced greedily. He was brushing crumbs from his shirt when the mirror shimmered more brightly than usual, the surface brightening in slow pulses like the steady beat of a distant drum. Ethan froze. Usually the mirror dimmed before a vision, its surface deepening into a kind of odd twilight, but now it was lighting up, warming, almost glowing. He leaned in, breath caught in his lungs. At first the image formed slowly, blurred shapes swirling like mist, then, as the glow concentrated, the fog parted and revealed something shocking not because it was supernatural but because it was eerily mundane. It showed him at a meeting. Sitting confidently at a round table, presenting the renderings of his newest tower. His hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate, his posture commanding. The others at the table watched him with rapt attention. The vision shifted slightly, showing the full room. And Ethan saw the final render projected behind him, his own design, but refined beyond what he'd drawn, almost as though someone had improved upon his work with techniques he had never learned. He stared, entranced. But then his heart lurched. The reflection in the mirror, his reflection, was watching the vision too. And in that reflection, his pupils were missing again. This time, they did not reappear. He stepped back sharply, banging into the corner of his drafting desk. Pain shot through his hip, grounding him, but he barely noticed. His reflection's eyes were hollow, blank, smooth depressions of darkness. "Stop," he whispered to the mirror, though he had no idea what he expected to happen. The mirror obeyed. The vision vanished instantly. The room snapped back into place like a rubber band released from full tension. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, taking slow breaths, trying to steady the sudden swirl of dizziness in his head. When he opened his eyes, the mirror's surface was still. But the pupilless reflection remained. Ethan's blood ran cold. His throat tightened painfully. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he raised a hand and waved it. His physical hand moved normally. His reflection's hand followed, perfectly in sync, but the eyes remained hollow. "This isn't real," he murmured, voice cracking. "You're not real." The reflection tilted its head. A simple movement. A human movement. But the way it lingered at the end of the tilt, the slow, deliberate pause, was not his. Ethan stumbled backward until he hit the wall beside the window. He forced himself to look away from the mirror, to stare at anything else, the floorboards, the fading paint on the walls, the half-open sketchbook on his desk. And when he finally dared to look back, the pupils had returned. He sagged against the wall in trembling relief. But that night, as he lay awake listening to the faint hum of the city, Ethan realized something with cold, absolute clarity. The mirror wasn't taking his reflection apart by accident. It was taking inventory. Success did not arrive slowly for Ethan, it surged into his life with the force of a tide long held back, pulling him forward so quickly that he barely had time to register the shift. 1 week after the mirror began offering its nightly visions, he found himself sitting in conference rooms he had once only seen from the outside, surrounded by people who suddenly regarded him as if he were someone to be taken seriously, someone whose ideas mattered, someone who had, without warning, become a rising name in New York's architectural world. The developer who had emailed him, the one whose interest he had assumed would fade, requested a formal meeting, then a second, then asked him to prepare a proposal for a mid-sized cultural center. Ethan presented his design with a confidence he didn't fully recognize. Words flowed through him like warm current, steady and sure, and the developers listened, captivated. When they offered him the commission, he managed to keep his face composed, but inside his chest something unfurled, a bright, fierce hunger that felt almost painful. Yet in the quiet moments between the rising tide of opportunities, he couldn't ignore the other feeling that tugged at him, a colder, smaller thing like a thin piece of ice lodged beneath his ribs. The mirror had not shown him another vision since the night his reflection lost its pupils. He had checked it every evening, waiting for the dimming shimmer, the rippling sheen, but the glass remained blank and still, too still, as though resting after exertion. But the stillness didn't reassure him, it felt deliberate, measured, watchful. He found himself glancing at it more often, especially in the mornings before leaving for his meetings. He would pause by the doorway, half-dressed, coffee cooling on his desk, turning toward the mirror with the hope that it might flicker, might guide him again, might offer him another impossible glimpse. But the mirror only held his reflection with an unnerving steadiness, giving nothing and taking nothing, or so he believed at first. It was a Thursday evening when he noticed the second change. He had just returned home from dinner with 2 colleagues, both senior architects at the firm that now contracted him. They had spent the meal asking questions, leaning toward him with an eagerness he had never experienced, eager to hear about his concepts, his inspirations, his design language. He answered in smooth phrases that surprised even him. But something about the dinner had been exhausting, not physically, but emotionally, the way pretending to be relaxed around strangers could drain a person to their bones. When he unlocked his front door, the familiar smell of his apartment, paper, graphite, polished wood, washed over him, grounding him slightly. He set his coat on the hook, loosened his tie, paced a few steps across the room. His eyes drifted, inevitably, toward the gilded mirror. It reflected him in the lamplight, tall, slightly disheveled, shoulders tense. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and walked toward it, not expecting anything, only wanting to see himself clearly after an evening of masks. But when he reached the mirror, he froze. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. His reflection looked normal, hair slightly mussed from the wind, tie crooked, expression faintly tired. But something felt muted, incomplete, like a photograph missing a layer of contrast. He leaned closer, studying his face carefully. And that was when he realized, his reflection could not smile. The corners of the reflected mouth remained flat, no matter how he shifted his expression. He tested it, slowly lifting one corner of his real mouth, then both, then attempting a full smile. His actual face moved, the muscles tightening, the familiar stretch of skin. But the reflection stayed frozen, the lips unmoved, a smooth neutral line etched across its face. A cold pressure spread through Ethan's chest. He lifted a hand to his jaw, touching it lightly to ensure the muscles worked. They did. He ran his fingers along the curve of his cheek, the ridge of his mouth. Everything felt alive, responsive, warm. But in the mirror his reflection mirrored the gesture only partially, the movement slightly stiff, as though mimicking rather than following. "Not again," he whispered, voice barely audible. "Not another piece." The words left him before he could stop them. Another piece. Another detail. Another part of him that the mirror had taken. Numbness crawled up the back of his neck. He sat on the edge of his desk chair, running a shaky hand through his hair. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe the mirror was warped, or the lighting distorted the reflection. He stood and turned on an additional lamp, flooding the room with warm yellow light. He approached the mirror again, slowly, carefully, bracing himself for the truth he already feared. There was no distortion. His reflection still could not smile. The realization settled into him like dust sinking in water, slow, steady, impossible to reverse. "What do you want?" he muttered to the mirror, his voice low and hoarse. The mirror, as always, gave no answer. But he felt something, a faint ripple in the air, a subtle tightening of the room, as though the mirror were listening, considering. Ethan's throat tightened. He stepped away abruptly, stumbling slightly as his foot caught the corner of his drafting table. His sketchbooks lay open on the desk, filled with lines and forms pulled from the visions the mirror had given him. For the first time, he felt repulsed by them, ashamed of the hunger that had guided him so easily toward the mirror's offering. "I should stop," he whispered, though the words tasted insincere even as he said them. "I should put a sheet over it. Move it to the closet. Forget about it." But he didn't move. He couldn't. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, exhaustion weighing heavily on his limbs, his thoughts drifted to the smile he could no longer see in the mirror. He tried to remember the last time he had smiled genuinely, not out of politeness or habit, but from real joy. It had been months. Maybe longer. He thought about calling someone, his sister, maybe, or his old friend Nate from college, but the idea felt heavy, almost suffocating. What would he say? "Hey, do you ever feel like your reflection is losing pieces of you?" The absurdity kept him silent. The fear kept him awake. Over the next week, the change in his reflection began bleeding into his interactions with others. Colleagues praised his work but looked subtly unsettled when speaking to him, their eyes flicking over his face with faint confusion, as though trying to reconcile something they couldn't articulate. One afternoon, after presenting a revised concept, his project manager, Leah, paused before responding, her brow furrowing slightly as she studied him. "You seem different lately," she said softly, choosing her words with care. "Is everything okay?" Ethan forced a laugh, a sound that felt strangely flat in his own ears. "Just busy. Lots of deadlines." "No," she said gently, "it's not that. It's your face. You look," she hesitated. He waited, his pulse quickening. "Like you're not really here," she finished. "Like you're thinking about something far away." And when you smile, it looks like you're forcing it. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't think I smiled at all in the meeting. Exactly, she murmured, as though that confirmed something. That night her words echoed in him long after he left the office building, walking through the city streets with cold wind cutting across his cheeks. He passed illuminated storefronts, their displays catching fleeting glimpses of his face as he moved. In each reflection, glass, metal, polished stone, he saw only a faint approximation of emotion, a mouth half-curved without intention, a gaze that looked hollow no matter how he tried to animate it. He tried to shake it off, but the truth settled in deeper with each passing block. His real face still moved. But the emotions behind the movements felt thinner, stretched. As if an invisible hand had reached beneath his skin and scraped away something essential. When he returned home, he stood before the mirror again, compelled, drawn, restless, and this time the mirror's surface was colder, darker, holding no vision, only his hollow-eyed reflection. "What are you doing to me?" he whispered, voice barely steady. The reflection stared back with its expressionless mouth, its perfect imitation of him stripped of warmth. And then, the glass rippled. Once. Slowly. Deliberately. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a sudden coldness sweeping through his chest like a shadow passing across his heart. He stepped back, breath trembling. The mirror didn't dim or glow. It simply acknowledged him, as though reminding him that the exchange was not one-sided, that the cost of his ambition had already been chosen. That night he didn't sleep at all. He sat at his drafting table, sketching motions he couldn't control, building shapes that came as if whispered to him, not by the mirror but by something he carried now, something fretted inside him. And though he wanted to believe he could stop, could take back control, could distance himself from the gilded frame that had ensnared him, he knew the truth long before he allowed himself to say it. The mirror had given him success. The mirror had taken his smile. And it was not finished. Ethan had always assumed that losing a face, losing the ability to be recognized, would happen dramatically, with some sudden jolt of pain or a moment of violent rupture, but in truth the unraveling began so quietly he almost didn't notice. It started with pauses during conversations, subtle hesitations that seemed unrelated to anything he had said, moments when colleagues looked at him with a flicker of uncertainty before recovering their composure as though their minds needed an extra beat to remember who he was. At first he attributed it to their own distractions, overwork, stress, the city's relentless pace, but after the third or fourth time it happened in the span of 2 days, he felt a familiar coldness settle into his stomach, a coldness that reminded him of the mirror's surface before a vision. The change became impossible to ignore during a client meeting for the Cultural Center project. He arrived early, carrying a meticulously prepared portfolio and the polished renderings he had refined from the mirror's earlier visions. The receptionist glanced up as the door chimed, her polite smile practiced and neutral. Ethan greeted her by name. He remembered it clearly from their last interaction, but her expression faltered, the smile dimming into confusion before she recovered it. "Good morning, sir," she said, hesitating on the last word, eyes flicking over his face as if searching for something she should recognize and failing to find it. "Do we have an appointment today?" Ethan blinked. "Yes," he said slowly. Ethan Ward. "For the 10 o'clock design review." Her confusion deepened. "Let me check," she murmured, turning to her computer, typing quickly. Then she said something that made his pulse stop for a fraction of a second. "I see an appointment under that name, but," she looked at him again, searching his face with faint unease. "You don't look like the photograph on file." Ethan felt the room tilt slightly. "May I see it?" She hesitated, then turned her monitor slightly. It was a picture he remembered taking, clean lighting, professional attire, the controlled confidence he had tried to project. But the face in the photo had definition, clarity, emotion. It was unmistakably him. And yet, looking at his reflection in the darkened surface of the monitor, he saw something disconcerting. The proportions matched, the silhouette was the same, but the details blurred. His cheekbones, yes, but softened. The curve of his lips, but without texture. The slight asymmetry that made his face uniquely his was smoothed away, replaced by an uneasy neutrality, like an unfinished sketch. He forced a steady breath. "The lighting's just different," he said lightly, though his voice lacked conviction. The receptionist nodded slowly, uncertain but willing to accept the explanation. "I'll tell them you're here," she murmured. The meeting itself was productive, even enthusiastic. His design was praised, his insights valued, but throughout the conversation the client stared at him with a faint inconsistency, as though the connection between his voice and his face was weakening. At one point, one of the senior partners paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing slightly. "Have we met before?" he asked, tilting his head. Ethan nearly laughed from the absurdity. "Yes," he said gently. "This is our third review." The partner gave an embarrassed smile, muttered something about lack of sleep. But Ethan knew. The mirror was taking something. No, had already taken it. When he returned home that evening, the first thing he did was stand in front of the gilded mirror, heart hammering violently against his ribs. He couldn't breathe until he looked. And when he did, the breath left him all at once. His reflection had no face. It wasn't blank, not exactly. It was worse than blank. It was unfinished. Features faintly suggested, shadows where eyes should be, a slight protrusion hinting at a nose, a smudge where lips might form, but nothing defined, nothing whole. Like a painter had planned to finish the portrait but lost interest halfway. Ethan staggered back, hitting the edge of the drafting table hard enough to send his pencils rolling across the floor. "No," he whispered. "Not this. Not all of it." His reflection stared back with that terrible incomplete stillness. But when he lifted his hand, the reflection mirrored the gesture perfectly, the faceless silhouette raising its pale, unshaped limb in eerie synchronization. He watched it for a long time, unable to tear his gaze away, his breath shallow, his skin prickling with cold sweat. "Why?" he whispered, not to the reflection but to whatever lived behind the glass. "What do you want from me?" The mirror did not ripple. Did not shimmer. Did not change. It only waited, silent and patient, like a door already halfway open. Ethan turned away abruptly, pacing the studio apartment in frantic circles. His mind raced through possibilities, hallucination, exhaustion, a neurological disorder, but none of those could explain the way other people had begun to forget him, the way reflection after reflection, windows, metal railings, elevator doors, showed him the same softening, the same blur. He stopped beside his desk and grabbed his phone. His sister, Rachel, lived only 2 hours away. They hadn't spoken much lately, his own fault, his own distance, but she knew his face better than anyone. She would tell him the truth. With trembling hands, he pressed her contact and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice. "Ethan," she answered, her voice warm, familiar. Relief nearly buckled his knees. "Hey," he said, swallowing hard. "Can you see me for a second? I want a video call." Applause. "Is everything okay? Just, please." She sighed softly, then agreed. The video icon flashed. He tapped it. The screen went black for a moment before the camera activated, showing his apartment behind him. But not his face. The front camera struggled, trying to catch focus. Shapes blurred, sharpened, blurred again. Rachel's image appeared in the corner, concerned. "Ethan." "Yeah," he croaked. "I'm here." "I can't see you," she said slowly. "Your camera's dirty." He wiped it quickly, breath shaking. "Try now." The camera focused for a heartbeat, long enough for Ethan to see the truth. The screen showed his outline, the shape of his shoulders, the movement of his arms, but his face was a smear of pixels, a digital ghost of skin tones with no features at all. Rachel gasped softly. "Ethan, what's wrong with your camera?" It's not the camera," he whispered. Silence. Heavy, dreadful silence. "What do you mean?" He ended the call. He couldn't say it aloud. Not yet. Not to her. That night he didn't approach the mirror. He tried to avoid even looking in its direction, but the pull was unbearable, like a low hum vibrating beneath the floorboards, beneath his skin, beneath the space between his ribs. Near midnight, exhausted and hollow, he finally turned to face it. He expected the faceless silhouette again. And it was there. But now it had shifted slightly, leaning forward, as though listening for something. Watching him more intently. Ethan felt something inside him break. "Take it back," he whispered, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at him. "Please. Take it back. I don't want this." The mirror remained still. The faceless reflection did not move. But as Ethan reached the frame, pressing both palms against the gilded edges, the glass rippled, not once, but continuously, like a breath drawn in and held. And then he heard it, not a voice, not a word, but a sensation, something pressing gently against his mind with a meaning that struck him as clearly as language. "You opened the door." Ethan shook his head violently. "I didn't know." Another impression, softer than the first, blooming inside the darkness behind the glass. "You knew enough." He staggered back. The mirror stilled. He stared at it, chest heaving. "What happens now?" he asked. The answer came not in sound but in the silence that followed, an immense, heavy silence that seemed to reshape the air around him. He turned away, stumbling to the windows. Outside, the city lights shimmered. People walked on the sidewalks far below, laughter drifting from a bar on the corner, the world blissfully unaware of the man inside the upper-floor apartment who no longer had a face. Ethan pressed his forehead to the glass, staring at his blurry reflection in the darkened window. No features. No identity. No trace of the man he had been. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Please. I just want to be seen." The room behind him remained silent. But the mirror seemed to lean closer. It happened more gently than Ethan had imagined. No tearing, no sudden collapse, no dramatic confrontation with the gilded mirror that had slowly been unmaking him, but with the quiet inevitability of fog rolling across a harbor, softening the lights until even the brightest lamp became nothing more than a muted suggestion. The unraveling of his existence continued not through horror, but through absence, a thinning of presence so delicate he barely felt its progress, only noticed its effects in the way the world responded to him as though he were a stranger passing through rooms he had once owned. The morning after his faceless reflection first stared back at him, he went to the office to finalize the cultural center design, carrying a folder thick with refinements he hoped might ground him again in reality. But when he entered the conference room, the team seated around the table stopped mid-discussion, eyes settling on him with polite confusion, the kind reserved for a delivery person or lost visitor. "Can I help you?" someone asked, their tone courteous but distant. Ethan tried to steady his breath. "It's me," he said quietly. Ethan Ward. "We're reviewing the west facade today." Their faces shifted with discomfort, some exchanged glances, others smiled weakly as if indulging a stranger. "I'm sorry," the project manager said gently, "we don't have anyone here by that name." His throat closed. "I presented this design. I brought the earlier models, look, here." He opened the folder, sliding the renderings onto the table. The drawings looked perfect, his style unmistakable, but beneath the corner where he had signed, the lines of his name were gone, faded into blank paper as though erased by time. "Someone must have removed," he whispered, but the lie drowned in his own disbelief. The team murmured apologies, ushering him out with the slow, careful kindness one uses with someone confused or lost. When the doors shut behind him, he stood motionless in the hallway, heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. He spent the rest of the day drifting through the city in a daze, passing shops whose windows reflected nothing but a soft blur where his face should have been. Once, he stepped into a cafe and ordered a coffee out of instinct, but the barista blinked at him with mild confusion, as if the sound of his voice didn't quite reach her. "Sorry," she said, tapping the counter. "What did you want again?" He opened his mouth, only to feel the words thinning, dissolving before they could fully form. "Never mind," he whispered, turning away, suddenly exhausted. His phone didn't help. Texts he sent went unanswered, or were received with responses like "Who is this?" or "Wrong number." His bank app logged him out repeatedly, not recognizing his face or his name. By evening, he felt a strange hollowness blooming behind his chest, as though something inside him had loosened its grip. When he returned home, the mirror waited there silently, reflecting the dim apartment with unsettling clarity. Ethan shut the door behind him and leaned against it, exhausted. He stared at the mirror for a long time, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "You're taking everything," he whispered, though part of him wondered if he even had a voice left to hear. The mirror didn't shimmer or ripple. It didn't need to. Its stillness felt like acknowledgement. He crossed the room slowly, knees weak, stopping just short of touching the frame. His reflection, or the soft, shape-like absence where a reflection should have been, stood before him, posture identical, movements delayed by the slightest margin, as though whatever lived inside the glass was learning how to become him. Ethan's hands trembled. "What do you want now?" he whispered. The answer brushed against him like a cool breath, to complete the exchange. His heart thudded painfully. "What am I, then?" He didn't expect a response, and none came. Instead, the mirror dimmed, the surface deepening into that familiar twilight shimmer, only this time, no vision formed, no future building, no promised triumph. What appeared instead was his apartment, exactly as it was, but without him. The desk, the books, the scattered pencils. The lamp's soft glow. The city beyond the window. All unchanged, except for one thing. In the corner where the mirror stood, the gilded frame gleamed empty, polished to a brilliance that seemed almost celebratory. Ethan stared, cold pooling through his limbs. He reached out, fingers brushing the glass. It felt warm, warm like skin, warm like breath exhaled across his palm. The surface rippled lightly, invitingly, not tugging but beckoning, offering not escape but acceptance. A memory surfaced then, small, fragile, yet piercing, his first semester in New York, walking through the same streets alone, believing the city would swallow him whole unless he carved his name into it with work so undeniable it forced the world to look at him, to see him, to acknowledge him. And now here he was, unseen completely, swallowed not by the city but by his own hunger. "I just wanted a chance," he whispered. The mirror pulsed once, gently, as if agreeing. He closed his eyes. And when he opened them, he understood, not through logic, but through the instinctual clarity that comes moments before surrender. He leaned forward and pressed both palms to the glass. The surface softened, yielding beneath his hands like warm water. A faint current tugged him, not forcefully, but with the persuasive gentleness of something that knew he had no other direction left to go. His breath steadied, then slowed. He felt the edges of himself unraveling, not painfully, but tenderly, slipping like fog through fingers. The room around him dimmed, its colors draining out, replaced by the faint golden shimmer of the mirror's inner light. And then he stepped forward. Or fell forward. Or dissolved forward. The distinction no longer mattered. The glass closed behind him with the quiet finality of a door that was never meant to open twice. Late that night, a neighbor passing Ethan's apartment paused at the faint sound of something shifting inside, a soft, metallic breath, like fabric brushing metal, but when she knocked, no one answered, and the sensation passed quickly, swallowed by the silence of the hallway. Days later, colleagues spoke vaguely of a young architect who had come to the firm briefly, someone promising, someone brilliant, though none of them could quite recall his face or where he'd gone. The cultural center design moved forward, credited to a committee rather than an individual. Life, as it always did, reorganized itself around the absence. And in the dim apartment 4 floors above the street, the gilded mirror stood gleaming quietly, its surface warm with a lingering radiance. If someone had looked closely, very closely, they might have noticed that the deep shimmer of the glass held a faint outline, not of a person but of a soft, human-shaped emptiness, as though a presence had been etched into the glow rather than reflected by it. And where a face should be, there was nothing but a smooth, perfect silence, an absence so complete it felt almost reverent. It was the last thing Ethan Ward ever became, not a man, not a memory, but a hollow in the light, a space carved into the gold, a reminder that the price of being seen can sometimes be to disappear entirely. The mirror approved of this. And the gilded emptiness gleamed. Story 2. Lyra Whitlow had always believed that Vermont carried a different kind of silence, one that didn't just settle over the land but seeped into it, filling the valleys and orchards with a stillness so complete it sometimes felt like the world was inhaling and forgetting to exhale. And on the evening when everything began, she found herself walking through that silence as though it were a physical thing brushing against her skin. The air was cool, October cold, carrying the faint scent of apples rotting sweetly in the grass, mixed with a darker, older smell rising from the earth behind her family's farmhouse, a house that leaned slightly to the left as if tired of holding itself upright after so many years of storms and winters. Lyra walked with her head tucked down, not because of the wind but because she had learned long ago that raising her head invited glances, and glances invited whispers, and whispers inevitably drifted toward the purplish birthmark stretching across her left cheek like a spilled stain, the thing that made people look twice and then look away just as quickly. Her parents told her it made her unique, but children did not want to be unique, they wanted to disappear into sameness, and Lyra had never been good at disappearing. Even the trees seemed to stare at her sometimes, or so she imagined when the wind pressed their branches together and made a sound like muted breath. But that evening, for reasons she couldn't explain, she did not turn back toward the farmhouse after finishing her chores. She crossed instead toward the far edge of their land, the part her parents never bothered with anymore, the old orchard that had belonged to the property long before the Whitlows inherited it, a small grove tucked between a hill of moss-covered granite and a low patch of marsh that steamed faintly in the mornings. The orchard had not borne fruit in decades, or so her father claimed, but Lyra had always felt something about it was different from the rest of the farm, as if the trees were watching their own slow decay with a kind of patient expectation, like actors waiting for a cue. The ground changed as she approached, the grass thinning, the soil darkening to a shade almost black beneath the rust-colored leaves. The air felt heavier too, denser, carrying an odd coolness that did not belong to the season. Lyra hesitated at the rustic gate, its hinges shrieking softly when she pushed it open, and for a moment she considered turning back. Something about the orchard made her heart beat heavier, not faster, as if it were sinking deeper into her chest. But curiosity tugged at her. A softness, almost like a whisper, brushed against her ear. She stepped inside. The orchard was smaller than she remembered, rows of trees gnarled and twisted, their branches bare except for a few stubborn leaves clinging to the tips like fragile memories. The silence inside the grove felt different from the silence outside it. It wasn't the gentle hush of rural Vermont, but a deeper, weightier quiet, as though the grove had swallowed every sound and left nothing but the faint hum of the earth beneath her feet. Lyra walked slowly between the trees, dragging her fingertips along the brittle bark. She told herself she was only exploring, only killing time before her parents called her in for dinner, but a part of her felt pulled, drawn deeper into the orchard by something she couldn't name. It was near the very back of the grove, where the trees leaned together in a crooked archway, that she saw it, a single tree she had never noticed before, standing apart from the others. Unlike the rest, it wasn't bare. Its branches were heavy with fruit. Lyra froze. The fruit glowed faintly, so faintly she wondered if she imagined it, an opalescent white, smooth as polished porcelain, each orb shaped like a teardrop rather than an apple. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, the grass beneath her shoes whispering like something alive. Up close, the fruit looked almost translucent, the pale skin shimmering with a soft halo whenever the dying light of the sky touched it. She reached out without thinking, then pulled her hand back as a cold shiver traveled up her spine. Something about the tree felt awake, watching. Her heart drummed unevenly. "What are you?" she whispered, though she did not expect an answer. But the orchard responded with a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone quietly exhaling through cracked lips. The wind, she told herself. Just the wind. Yet the surrounding trees were still, not a single branch stirring. Against all instinct, she stepped closer and gently nudged one of the porcelain fruits. It detached from the branch with a soft, delicate snap, as though it had been waiting for her. She stared at it in her cupped palms. The fruit was warm. Not warm like something heated by sunlight, warm like skin. A faint pulse drummed beneath her fingers. Lyra almost dropped it. But she didn't. Instead, she cradled it like a fragile bird, feeling something strange unfurl inside her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. She brought the fruit to her nose. It smelled faintly sweet, like apples mixed with something floral and distant, something she couldn't place. She hesitated only a moment longer. Then she bit into it. The fruit didn't crunch. It dissolved, melting like snow on her tongue, cold at first, then warming as it slid down her throat. A shiver ran through her entire body, sharp but not painful, like the sudden intake of breath when stepping into warm water after being cold for too long. Her vision blurred at the edges, colors softening, sharpening, softening again. The orchard tilted slightly. And then everything went still. Lyra blinked, confused, licking the last trace of sweetness from her lips. The fruit was gone. Completely. Night pressed in around her, the sky turning a deeper shade of blue. She backed away from the tree slowly, every instinct suddenly begging her to return home. And then she heard it, a soft sound, wet, trembling, impossibly quiet. A sob. A child's sob. Lyra spun, heart hammering, scanning the orchard for someone hiding among the trees. "Hello?" she whispered. The sobbing faded, swallowed by the heavy air. She waited, breath held. Nothing, just silence again. On unsteady legs, she rushed home, brushing dirt from her skirt, wiping cold sweat from her brow. She told no one what she'd found, afraid the words would make it real in a way she wasn't ready to face. That night, she slept restlessly, tossing under the heavy quilt, her dreams filled with pale fruit and the echo of that fragile cry. She awoke before dawn. And for the first time in her life, the mirror on her dresser did not show the pale purplish birthmark on her cheek. Her skin was smooth. Clear. Unmarked. She touched her face with trembling fingers, unable to breathe, unable to blink. She looked beautiful, shockingly so. Perfect, even. A warmth bloomed in her chest, so big and bright it felt like it might lift her off the floor. But as she stared at her reflection, smiling and crying at the same time, she felt something else, something she had never expected, something she could not explain, shift beneath the surface of her skin. Something that felt like the earth beneath the orchard, old, restless, waiting. And then she heard it again. Soft. Broken. Faint as morning frost melting. Someone crying. But this time the sound was inside her walls. Inside her room. Inside her. Lyra had expected the change to feel miraculous in a loud, cinematic way, expected trumpets, fireworks, some kind of swelling revelation that would tell her a new life had truly begun, but the transformation greeted her in the soft gray light before sunrise with a quiet so complete she almost doubted her own senses. She woke with her cheek pressed against the pillow, eyes gritty with half-dreams, and the usual dread of seeing her birthmark, of bracing for its heavy, uneven outline, still clung to her until she blinked and caught sight of something pale and smooth in the edge of the mirror. She sat up too quickly, the quilt sliding to the floor as she rushed forward. Her reflection met her in stunned silence. The purplish stain that had shaped her entire life, every glance, every whisper, every sidelong stare, was gone. Vanished. Her skin looked impossibly even, luminous in a way that reminded her of moonlit snow. She touched her cheek with shaking fingers, expecting something to feel wrong, or stiff, or different somehow, but her skin felt like skin, warm, soft, alive. For several long breaths she simply stared, tears blurring the reflection as relief washed through her with such overwhelming force it almost hurt. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both, pressing her palms against her mouth to smother the sound before it reached her parents' room. For the first time in her life, Lyra wanted to run outside, to show her face to the world rather than hide it. And for the first time in years, she didn't dread school. At breakfast her mother did a double take, the wooden spoon clattering against the edge of the pot. "Lyra, sweetheart, your face, what happened?" Her father stared too, his brow tightening with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. Lyra instinctively reached up, fingertips brushing her cheek, afraid that speaking aloud might break the spell. I don't know," she stammered, though part of her felt that wasn't true. "It was gone when I woke up." Her mother approached slowly, gently tilting her daughter's chin toward the window light. "Your skin looks different," she murmured, searching for the right word. "Not just clearer." Almost, she stopped herself. But Lyra heard the word anyway. "Perfect." She shrugged awkwardly, tucking her hair behind her ears so neither of them would see her trembling hands. "Maybe it was hormones," she said softly. "Dr. Winters said they can change things." Her father nodded, willing to accept any explanation that made their daughter happy. Her mother did too, though Lyra saw uncertainty linger in her eyes like a shadow. At school, the transformation didn't go unnoticed. Whispers followed her, but not the old kind. This time they were breathless, startled, awed. She caught snippets as she passed lockers. "Is that Lyra?" "No way, she looks like a totally different person. How did she?" For once, the stares didn't sting. They warmed her, soothed her, made her feel visible in a way that didn't hurt. Even the girls who once snickered at her exchanged hesitant smiles, the kind offered to someone unfamiliar but intriguing. Lyra walked the hallways dazed, floating. Maybe, she thought, this was what normal felt like. Maybe this was what being seen felt like. The day passed in a blur of new glances and shy compliments, and though a small, uneasy part of her whispered warnings beneath her happiness, she pushed them away. Didn't she deserve this? Didn't she, for once, deserve to feel ordinary? To feel beautiful? But the warmth of the day evaporated quickly when dusk fell over the Whitlow farm. As the sun sank behind the hills, the strange hush of the orchard crept toward the house, sliding across the fields like a silent tide. After dinner, as the wind shifted, Lyra felt a prickle at the back of her neck, the same sensation she'd felt last night in the orchard just before she heard the sobbing. She excused herself early and retreated to her room, though she barely reached her bed before a sound froze her in place. Thut-thit, thut-thit. A soft, broken crying, like a wounded creature trying hard not to be heard. But this time, it wasn't muffled by distance. It was close. Inside the walls, or beneath the floorboards, or just behind her. Lyra backed against her desk, hands clutching its edges. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. Silence followed, deep, heavy, unnatural. Lyra waited for a long time, but no answer came. Eventually, she crawled into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She lay awake for hours, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for any hint of movement. When sleep finally came, it felt thin, fragile, easily breakable. The moment the sun rose, she stumbled outside, needing air. Needing proof that the orchard hadn't followed her home. But what she saw made her breath stutter. One of the trees, the ones that had always stood bare and lifeless, had collapsed overnight. Its limbs curled inward like fingers clutching its own trunk, the bark split open in jagged seams, the earth beneath it cracked and pale. She approached slowly, heart pounding. Her father stood a few feet away, staring at the tree with perplexed frustration. "Damn thing was fine yesterday," he muttered, kicking at the brittle roots. "Now look at it. Rot all the way through." But Lyra wasn't looking at the roots. She was staring at the trunk, at the way one long fissure ran down the center, pale and thin and almost beautiful. The shape of it mirrored something she had seen before. She reached up and touched her cheek. Nothing. Smooth and perfect. But as she turned her hand in the morning light, she saw it, barely visible, so faint she had to squint, right at the edge of her jawline. A hairline crack. Thin as a strand of spider silk. Pale as porcelain. She jerked back, pulse hammering. "No," she whispered. "No, no, She ran inside, racing to the mirror in her room. At first she saw nothing wrong. Her skin was flawless, glowing with that strange, otherworldly softness. But when she leaned closer, when the light hit at just the right angle, there it was, a tiny fracture, tracing the exact curve of the dead tree's cracked bark. Lyra's breath trembled. "This can't be real," she whispered. But then she remembered the warmth of the fruit. The faint pulse beneath her fingertips. The echo of that broken sob. She touched the crack again, and for a second, just a second, she swore she felt something beneath the surface of her skin. Something hollow. Something shifting. She stumbled away from the mirror, clutching her arms around herself as a wave of cold swept through her. Outside her window, the orchard stood silent, its branches unmoving though the wind pressed against them. And somewhere deep within the grove, she heard it, so faint she almost doubted it. A whisper. A sob. A voice that sounded like someone crying, not from pain, but from being forgotten. Lyra pressed her hands against her ears. But the sound wasn't coming from outside anymore. This time, it was coming from within her chest. From inside the crack. She slid down to the floor, tears spilling silently as she pressed her forehead to her knees. And for the first time since the fruit had melted like snow on her tongue, the thought struck her with cold, brutal clarity: beauty always demands a price. And the orchard had only just begun to collect. Lyra spent the next 2 days moving through the world like someone caught between waking and dreaming, her days filled with soft admiration and new attention, her nights drowned in the sound of distant crying that grew closer each time she closed her eyes, and the crack along her jaw, once a faint shimmer, deepened into a fine, pale line that traced the same uneven arc she'd seen carved into the dead tree's trunk. She dabbed makeup over it before school, her fingers trembling, but the concealer slid off as though her skin refused to hold it, leaving the porcelain-like fracture exposed beneath the morning light. At school she told herself no one noticed, but when she leaned forward to speak to her lab partner, the girl recoiled subtly before recovering with an awkward smile, as though her brain had registered something wrong before her mind caught up. "Static shock," the girl said with a small laugh, though Lyra hadn't touched her. And throughout the day a strange distance settled between Lyra and everyone around her, not the cruel avoidance she once endured but a kind of instinctive wariness, as if her new beauty were too sharp, too bright, too unnatural to look at for long. By afternoon Lyra's nerves were frayed, and she walked home with her hands shoved in her coat pockets, head low, trying to drown out the whispering unease that lived somewhere beneath her heartbeat. The wind clawed at her hair and carried the smell of cold earth, and as she approached the house, a sickening heaviness settled in her stomach. 3 more trees had collapsed in the orchard. She saw her father standing among them, his face flushed with frustration as he stared at their twisted forms. "What in God's name is happening to this place?" he muttered when he saw her approaching. "I swear they were fine yesterday." Lyra stared. The trees weren't simply dead, they were drained. Their bark had split into branching fissures, pale and fragile, as though the life inside had turned to dust and pushed its way outward. One trunk had ruptured completely, revealing an interior that was not the deep brown of decayed wood but a bone-white core like kiln-dried pottery. Lyra touched her cheek without thinking, fingers brushing the crack along her skin. It throbbed faintly, like something inside it was shifting. "Maybe it's a blight," she whispered. Her father shook his head. "Blight doesn't work overnight. And trees don't crack open like glass." Lyra swallowed. She wanted desperately to leave the orchard, to flee back into the house and bury herself beneath quilts until she forgot everything she'd seen, but something tugged at her, as steady and unyielding as an unseen hand around her wrist. She stepped closer to one of the fallen trees, crouching to inspect the jagged break near the roots. The earth here looked disturbed, not by weather or animals, but by hands that had dug long ago and then forgotten how to rise again. She leaned in. The soil wasn't just dark. It was disturbed into a shallow depression that looked eerily like a grave. A soft cry drifted up from the hollow, so faint she might have mistaken it for breath if she hadn't already heard that sound too many times. She froze. The sound rose again, wet, trembling, strained. Lyra. Her heart stopped. She staggered back, nearly falling. No, she told herself. No, no, no. That couldn't have been her name. She ran into the house before the sound could follow. But that night, the whisper didn't wait for her to fall asleep. It began the moment she lay down, treading through the darkness like a finger running along a violin string. Give it back. Lyra sat upright, clutching her quilt to her chest. Who's there? She whispered into the dark. The room breathed around her. And then, give it back. The voice was not a whisper now. Not breath. Not wind. It sounded like someone buried beneath dirt speaking through a cracked mouth full of earth. Lyra scrambled to her mirror, switching on the lamp beside it, needing to see herself, needing to prove she still existed in some stable form. The light flickered before settling. Her reflection stared back. At first she felt relief. Her face was still beautiful, still impossibly flawless. But then she leaned closer. And saw the new cracks. One along her cheek, spreading like the limb of a tree reaching toward her ear. Another branching from the first, tracing her temple. Her skin, her perfect skin, looked like porcelain that had been dropped on a stone floor and glued back together with trembling hands. She pressed her fingertips to one of the fractures. A faint, brittle sound whispered beneath her touch, like something shifting inside the cracks. And in that moment she understood with absolute, ice-cold clarity, whatever the orchard had taken, it was taking from her too. The next morning, Lyra rose before dawn and crept outside, drawn by a mixture of dread and a need for answers. Frost coated the grass, glittering in faint moonlight. Fog clung low to the ground, curling around her ankles like cold fingers. The orchard waited for her, its silence heavy, expectant. Lyra stopped just inside the gate, scanning the rows of trees. 6 of them were now dead, collapsed into themselves, bark split into white fractures that resembled broken ceramic. The 7th tree trembled slightly, leaves fluttering despite the still air, as though something deep within its trunk were struggling, straining. Lyra stepped closer. And the moment she did, the voice rose again, not from the sky, not from the trees, but from directly beneath her feet. You took what wasn't yours. She froze. The ground felt warm. Then something pushed upward against the soil, a shape, a soft bulge, as if something buried were reaching up. Lyra stumbled backward, her breath catching on a sob she didn't realize she'd made. What do you want? She whispered, though her voice cracked. Return the breath you stole. The words slid into her bones like cold water. Lyra shook her head, tears brimming. I didn't steal anything, she whispered. The fruit, I didn't know. Eat what is not yours, become what is not alive. The 7th tree shuddered violently. One of its porcelain white fruits dropped, hitting the ground with a sound too soft for its size, like flesh rather than fruit. Lyra stepped closer, slowly, terrified, yet unable to resist. She crouched beside the fallen fruit. It pulsed faintly. Just like the one she had eaten. Who are you? She breathed. The ground beneath the tree split. Not much, just an inch. But enough for the soft earth to reveal something pale beneath it. Something shaped like fingertips. Lyra's breath stopped. She backed away, clamping a hand over her mouth. The orchard had not simply grown from the earth, its roots were entwined with something buried deeper. Bodies. Lives. Souls. Give it back, the voice pleaded, weaker now, as though cracking under its own sorrow. Lyra pressed her back to one of the living trees, chest heaving. I can't, she whispered. I don't know how. The orchard sighed, a long, low sound like grief made wind. Lyra ran. She didn't stop until she reached the farmhouse, slamming the door behind her, her legs shaking so hard she almost collapsed. Her mother found her minutes later, pale and trembling. Baby, what's wrong? Lyra opened her mouth, meaning to lie, to say she felt sick, but the words didn't form. Instead, a hollow, brittle sound escaped her throat, a sound like something cracking. Her mother's eyes widened. "Your face, Lyra, your cheek." Lyra ran to the bathroom mirror. Another fracture had appeared, longer than the others, running from the corner of her mouth toward her ear. It glowed faintly beneath her skin, like a line of moonlight carved into porcelain. She touched it and recoiled. The crack was warm. Alive. And for the first time, she saw something beneath the surface, something moving slowly. Something pale. Something hollow. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. And then, from deep within her chest, from the place where the fruit's warmth had once settled, the voice rose again, soft, sorrowful, and unbearably close. "You are becoming the orchard." Lyra pressed her palms to her face, tears streaming down as the truth settled into her like cold soil filling a grave. Outside, another tree died. She heard it fall. And under her skin, another crack bloomed. Lyra had never feared the dark, not really, not until the night the orchard began to die all at once, the night when the usual velvet hush of the Vermont countryside felt heavier than snowdrifts and sharper than frostbite, pressing against the farmhouse walls as though the night itself were waiting for something to break. She sensed it before it happened, lying in bed with the quilt drawn to her chin, her breath shallow as the cracks along her skin pulsed faintly beneath her nightgown like thin lines of heat. Outside, the wind should have been howling through the eaves, but instead the night held its breath, so still, so absolute, that Lyra could hear the faint groan of the old barn timbers settling in their sleep. Sleep never came for her. She lay awake, clutching the pillow to her chest, listening. Waiting. And then she heard it, a snap, sharp, violent, like bone breaking under weight. Lyra sat upright. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing across the fields. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't branches in the wind. It was too deliberate, too heavy. A tree splitting. Her heart lurched into her throat. She slipped from bed, feet touching the cold wooden floor, and moved toward the window as if drawn by a string pulling her from the inside. Outside, the orchard lay in black silhouette against the moonlit fog. Another crack tore through the night, so sudden she flinched. And when the sound hit her, she felt something else hit inside her, right beneath her ribs, a sharp, tearing ache that radiated outward like a ripple. She clawed at her nightgown, gasping. Pain wasn't the right word, it felt more like something tearing itself free under her skin. She stumbled to the mirror, switching on the lamp with trembling fingers. What she saw made her knees weaken. A new crack ran across her collarbone, long, delicate, branching into smaller fractures like the veins of a withered leaf. It glowed faintly, as if lit from within. Another tree, she thought. Another life draining out there, and into me. "Stop," she whispered to no one, pressing both palms against the glass as though the reflection might anchor her. "Please, stop." But the night was not done. Another crack of wood splitting open echoed across the field. And another line opened on Lyra's skin, this one along her shoulder, curving inward toward her throat. She cried out, falling to her knees as dizziness swallowed her. The house around her blurred, the lamp flickered. She crawled to the window, pulling herself up by the sill. The orchard writhed against the windless night. One tree toppled forward, its trunk cracking into pale dust. Another bent sideways, snapping at the roots, collapsing like a marionette whose strings had been cut. And with each fall, Lyra felt something inside her shift, an expansion, a swelling, a hollow warmth that pressed outward against her ribs. She pressed a shaking hand to her sternum. Beneath the thin cotton of her nightgown, something rounded pulsed gently, a soft, spherical shape pushing forward beneath her bones. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." Her legs shook as she ran from her room, stumbling down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. The front door resisted her for half a second before giving way, the cold night air slamming into her like a fist. She sprinted barefoot into the yard, ignoring the sting of frozen dirt against her soles. The orchard called her like a siren. She stumbled toward it, tears burning down her cheeks, the cracks along her skin tightening as though reacting to the cold. Her breath came in broken gasps. The nearer she came, the worse the pressure beneath her chest grew, warm, throbbing, insistent. As if something inside her was trying to beat in rhythm with the orchard. When she reached the gate, she froze. Nearly half the trees had fallen. Their white splintered trunks curved in unnatural shapes, as though the life inside had twisted violently before giving out. The earth beneath them bulged and sank in soft waves, like something moving just beneath the surface. Lyra whispered, "What did you do to them?" The orchard answered with a sound like 100 broken hearts sighing at once. She stepped forward, and her foot hit something hard. She looked down. A porcelain white fruit lay in the grass. Only this one wasn't glowing faintly like before. It pulsed. Strongly. Rhythmically. Like a heart. Lyra's stomach churned. She backed away, and stepped on something else. Something that made a soft, hollow clink. She lifted her foot. Another fruit. Cracked open. Empty inside. She knew that shape. Knew that emptiness. It matched the hollow she had felt growing under her ribs. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I took something. I shouldn't have taken anything." The orchard rustled, not from wind, but from the shifting of roots, the tightening of unseen limbs beneath the earth. Then she heard it again, "Lyra." But this time the voice was stronger. Multiple voices, layered, thin, crying, pleading, rising in an agonizing harmony from beneath the ground. She staggered forward like someone in a trance. One tree still stood intact in the very center of the orchard, the one that had given her the fruit. Its bark was wider now, its branches trembling like fingers pressed against invisible glass. As Lyra approached, the ground beneath it cracked. Not like roots shifting, this was deeper, wider, splitting like the earth was inhaling sharply in surprise. Lyra fell to her knees. The soil broke open. And beneath it, bones. Not clean, not rested, but tangled in roots, wrapped in pale threads of bark, held as though the earth refused to release them. And among them, scraps of cloth. A ribbon. A rusted hairpin. A small shoe. Lyra clapped a hand over her mouth, choking. "No," the orchard whispered back. "Yes, we gave them beauty too," they asked, they begged. The voices rose sharply, "And when the price was due, we took them, as we take you." Lyra screamed. A sharp, blinding pain shot through her chest. She clutched her sternum as something beneath her skin pushed outward, growing, rounding, expanding. She collapsed to the ground, curling around herself, shaking violently as the cracks along her arms and neck widened like dry riverbeds. Her skin felt too tight. Too thin. Like it was struggling to contain something larger than her body. "Please," she cried. "I don't want this anymore." "But you took it," the orchard hissed. "You ate what wasn't yours, and beauty that isn't earned must be paid for." Lyra sobbed, her tears dripping into the cracked soil. Beneath her, the roots pulsed, warm, alive, not like plants, but like arteries. And then she felt the truth, not in words, but in a heavy, ancient understanding pressed into her bones. The orchard had not grown from soil. It had grown from sorrow. From the bodies buried here long ago, girls like her, who had wished for beauty, wished to be seen, wished to be loved by a world that only looked at perfection. The orchard fed on longing. On envy. On grief. And the fruit was a gift born of sacrifice. Lyra had eaten their wish. Their life, their beauty. And now their debt lived under her skin. A low moan rose from the earth beneath her, a long, terrible wail that spread across the orchard like a cold wind. One final tree snapped, falling in a white spray of fractured bark. A final crack formed on Lyra's body, wide, jagged, cutting across her ribs like lightning trapped in porcelain. And the pulsing beneath her sternum grew stronger. Harder. Almost full. She clawed weakly at her chest, sobbing. "I don't want it," she screamed. "Take it back, just take it, please." But the orchard only sighed again, not cruelly, but with weary inevitability, as if it had watched this story play out dozens of times and knew there could only be one ending. Lyra lay in the cold black soil, cracking like a vase dropped too many times, as the orchard exhaled around her. And beneath her ribs, the white fruit that wasn't a fruit anymore beat softly, like a heart that no longer belonged to her. Dawn crept over the hillside with the kind of fragile light that looked as though it might shatter if touched, a soft wash of pale gold that barely warmed the frost-coated soil, and when Lyra opened her eyes to that dim morning glow, she felt the orchard before she saw it, the stillness, the heaviness, the absence, an emptiness so complete it vibrated quietly inside her chest like a bowl struck with a muted chime. Every tree was dead now. She sensed it instinctively, the entire orchard lying in collapsed heaps of white splintered wood, their once twisting limbs curled inward like bodies folded in on themselves. She tried to rise, but her body resisted, stiff and fragile, her joints moving with the smooth resistance of dried clay. She looked down at her arms. Nearly every inch of her skin was traced with cracks, fine ones like hairline fractures along her wrists, thicker ones like branching lightning striking across her ribs and collarbone, a jagged crescent at her hip that seemed to pulse with its own soft light. When she pressed a trembling hand to her chest, she felt the round shape beneath her sternum, warm, full, steady, pushing outward with each faint, imitation heartbeat. It didn't hurt anymore. That frightened her most. Pain had meant she was still fighting. This warmth felt like surrender. As she sat up slowly, pieces of dried earth and white dust slid from her nightgown. Her breath didn't fog the cold morning air. When she exhaled, it felt thin, weightless, as if her lungs were filled with something other than breath. She looked toward the house where her parents still slept, unaware. The thought of waking them flickered through her like a candle guttering in wind, but she knew she couldn't. How could she explain this? What words existed for a girl whose skin was becoming pottery, whose heart was becoming fruit, whose life was becoming something borrowed? What comfort could they offer, when the orchard whispered louder than any human voice? Lyra rose unsteadily, barefoot on the frost, feeling the cracks shift beneath her skin with each step. She walked through the gate, which hung crooked on one hinge. The orchard lay in ruins. Every single tree had fallen. Their white, shattered trunks glimmered faintly beneath the morning light, not like wood but like porcelain smashed against stone. The air felt different here, warm despite the frost, as if the orchard exhaled slowly around her. Beneath her feet, the soil pulsed with subtle heat. "We are here," the orchard whispered. "We are waiting." Lyra swallowed hard, tears burning behind her eyes. Why me? The wind didn't move. The fog didn't shift. But something deeper, older, responded in a tone softer than sorrow, heavier than regret. "Because you asked." Lyra shook her head, backing away from the fallen trunks. "I never asked for this. You wished to be seen." The word slid through her not as accusation but truth. Lyra's chest tightened. She sank to her knees beside the last tree to fall, the one that had given her the fruit. Its roots curled like skeletal fingers, their pale lengths splitting apart the dark soil. Beneath them, she saw remnants of cloth tangled in roots, the faint outline of human bone. A lock of hair. She looked away, choking on a sob. "I didn't know," she whispered. "None of us did." Lyra froze. The orchard hummed beneath her palms, soft, rhythmic, like a choir of distant voices speaking through earth and wood and memory. We were young. We were lonely. We wished too. Lyra pressed her hands against her face, feeling the cracks shift under her fingers. Pieces of dry, chalk-like skin flaked off, delicate as petals. "I didn't want anyone to hurt." "Beauty is hunger," the orchard murmured. The world taught you that. Lyra lowered her hands slowly. For a long time she sat in the cold mud, listening to the subtle heartbeat beneath the soil and the quiet, exhausted voices entwined within it. And then something changed. The pulsing beneath her sternum grew stronger. More insistent. As though impatient. As though ready. Lyra gasped, clutching her chest. The cracks along her shoulders flared with white light, spreading across her collarbone. Her knees buckled and she fell forward, catching herself on trembling hands. The orchard whispered with anticipation. "It is time. Please," she whispered through tears. "I don't want to die." Applause. "Then, you are not dying. You are becoming." Her breath fractured in her throat. Becoming what? But she already knew. She had known since the first crack. Since the first sob. Since the first fruit melted like snow in her hands. Her skin tightened, then loosened. A soft pop echoed inside her chest. She cried out, curling around the pressure blooming beneath her sternum. The white sphere pressed harder, her ribs creaked. The cracks along her skin spread, widening into luminous fractures that laced across her like delicate pottery lines. And through the pain, she felt something else, something terrifying. Relief. As if a long-held secret inside her had finally pushed forward enough to breathe. She fell onto her side in the frost, trembling, sobbing, the orchard's breath warm against the back of her neck. Her hair spilled across her face, and when she brushed it aside, a piece of her cheek flaked away, clean, white, hollow inside. She stared at it in horror. It gleamed faintly in her palm. Like the shell of a broken fruit. Like something waiting to be planted. A laugh caught in her throat, small, choked, desperate. And then, inexplicably, she smiled. Her lips cracked. The corners of her mouth split, delicate fissures radiating outward like the veins of a dried leaf. The smile deepened, not from joy, but from an exhausted, aching acceptance. Her face cracked again. And again. The orchard whispered in awe. The fruit beneath her sternum pushed outward, then stopped, as if sensing it had reached the surface. Lyra exhaled one last time, and the breath that left her was warm and sweet, like the scent of the porcelain apples. The thin shell of her chest split open, silently, gracefully, releasing a pale, perfect sphere that rolled gently onto the soil, pulsing softly like a heartbeat newly freed. Lyra's body sagged, hollow and weightless, a fragile vessel emptied of its borrowed beauty. The cracks spread, webbing across her arms and legs, her torso, her throat, until her entire form looked carved from white clay. Then, with a sound no louder than dried leaves brushing together, she collapsed inward, folding like a shell returning to the earth. The orchard waited. The ground warmed. The pale sphere nestled into the soil beside her, sinking slightly into the waiting earth. And somewhere beneath the fallen trees, the buried voices sighed, soft, grateful, resigned. By afternoon, the frost would melt. By spring, a new sapling would rise exactly where Lyra had fallen, thin, white-barked, trembling gently in the breeze. And in years to come, travelers passing through the quiet backroads of Vermont might stop and admire the tiny orchard behind the old Whitlow farmhouse, noticing one tree in particular whose fruit glowed faintly at dusk in the shape of teardrops. They would not know why the fruit pulsed warmly in their palms. They would not know who lay beneath the roots. But when they bit into the fruit, if they dared, they might swear they heard a girl's soft, brittle laughter echo from somewhere deep inside themselves, right before the orchard whispered, as it always did, beauty must be fed. And the hollow where Lyra Whitlow once existed would gleam quietly beneath the soil, waiting for the next wish to take root. Story 3. Elias Mercer had spent most of his adult life listening to trees, truly listening, not in the poetic way people sometimes meant when they talked about walking in forests to clear their minds, but in the literal sense of placing ground microphones deep beneath the soil to capture the faint tremors of root systems shifting through earth, the chemical murmurs exchanged between fungi and wood, the slow flexing and relaxing of living structures older than cities, he had always found a strange comfort. In those sounds, a reassurance that the world beneath the surface moved at a pace untouched by human urgency. But nothing in the quiet, measured language of roots prepared him for the old-growth forest of southern Oregon, and certainly not for the lone cabin he rented on a hill overlooking a valley where fog lingered long after the sun rose, clinging to the ground like an animal reluctant to leave its den. The cabin itself sat on wooden stilts, weathered by decades of wet winters, its porch listing slightly toward the slope, and from its back window Elias could see the crown of the ancient Douglas fir, the tree locals referred to only as the elder, towering above the rest of the forest like a cathedral spire. They said it was over 1,000 years old, though no one had taken a core sample in recent memory. Something about the tree inspired an unspoken agreement among the locals that it was better left unmeasured, uncut, undisturbed. Elias didn't believe in superstition. He believed in soil density, root volume, sound waves, but even he felt a quiver of reverence the first time he stood beneath the elder's canopy. The air beneath its branches felt different, thicker, cooler, almost humming with its own age. Moss draped from its limbs in heavy curtains, and the trunk was so wide that Elias couldn't wrap his arms halfway around it. The ground around it held a faint tremor even without any wind, as if the tree's slow pulse radiated outward into the soil. Perfect for research. He had come to Oregon for solitude, partly because his last research project, a highly publicized study on root communication, had unraveled under pressure he hadn't been prepared for, leaving him burned out and desperate for quiet. This forest promised quiet. Depth. A space where roots spoke honestly. Elias set up his equipment over the next week, laying out cables beneath the damp earth, driving slender sensors into the soil around the elder, and mapping the root spread using his seismograph array. He worked alone, speaking aloud only to narrate his notes or encourage the old equipment to behave. In those early days, the forest's silence felt like a balm. At night, he slept with the windows cracked open just to hear the faint sigh of wind through the canopy. But the silence never lasted long. It was on the 8th night, after a long day cataloging fine root tremors, that he heard something strange through the headphones. At first it was static, soft and intermittent. Static wasn't unusual. Cheap field equipment always produced noise, especially when dew settled heavily across the cables. But this static had a pattern, a faint, rhythmic pulse beneath it, like breath being pulled through teeth. Elias frowned, adjusting the dial on the receiver. The sound deepened slightly. Still noise, he told himself. Soil shifting as temperature changed. Wind vibrating the sensor frame. But the hairs on his arms rose anyway. He leaned closer, held his breath. Beneath the static came a whispering sound, soft, low, layered. Not leaves rubbing together. Not animals burrowing. Something else. Something almost like speech. Impossible, he murmured, sitting back quickly. He replayed the recording. The static repeated, the faint pulse beneath it repeating too, and then, just as before, the whispering emerged for half a second, too quick to decipher. Elias rubbed his temples, shaking off nerves. Audio illusion, he whispered. Your brain filling in patterns. He went to bed that night telling himself that exhaustion could mimic almost anything. But the next morning, he found the microphone cable leading to the elder dislodged from the soil, coiled gently beside the trunk as if someone had pulled it up and set it aside. Not torn. Not yanked by animals. Placed. Elias stared at the neatly coiled line for a full minute, cold wind creeping through the trees. Eventually he convinced himself he must have left it loose. He reinstalled it, burying it deeper than before. But that night, as he replayed the new recordings, the whispering returned, louder this time, more distinct. Still distorted, as though filtered through a throat full of gravel, but undeniably there. He froze, leaning over his notebook, pen hovering above the page. SCR, MR, the hairs on his neck prickled. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint tapping. A rhythmic knock. Once. Twice. 3 times. Elias swallowed. That tapping was close. Far too close. He muted the audio, pulling off the headphones. The room fell silent except for the faint groaning of the cabin's wooden frame settling in the cold. He exhaled shakily. "Get a grip," he muttered. "It's wind. Or a woodpecker." But a woodpecker didn't mimic speech. And wind didn't tap in trees. He tried to sleep, but he kept waking to the sensation of pressure beneath his bed, like the earth itself was shifting, as though something deep underground was turning over in its sleep. On the 10th day he expanded the sensor grid, installing microphones at different depths. He told himself he was being methodical, but the truth was simpler. He needed to know if the whispers came only from the elder or from the entire forest floor. The next recording session answered that question quickly. Only the microphone closest to the elder picked up anything. The others remained silent. Elias replayed the elder's audio alone. The whispers were clearer than ever, the distortion thinner. A scraping sound preceded them, like something dragging itself through heavy soil. Then came the whisper, low, rough, slow, but unmistakable. Dare, SSS, or his blood froze. It almost sounded like Mayor, Ser. His surname. Elias tore the headphones off his ears. His throat tightened with a mix of fear and denial. "Coincidence," he whispered. "Pareidolia. You're hearing what you expect." But he avoided the headphones for the rest of that day. Only when evening fell, when the forest dimmed into a color that felt older than night itself, did he return to the receiver. He sat for a long time before putting the headphones back on. The channel was quiet at first. Only faint static. Then, SRR. Something shifting beneath the ground. The whispering rose, fretting through the static like smoke curling through cold air. "Mayor, Sue." Elias pulled back, heart hammering. He was about to shut off the recorder when the voice deepened suddenly, the distortion smoothing just enough to form two clear words: "Go home." Elias froze. His pulse thudded in his ears. The cabin seemed to darken around him, the walls leaning inward as the whisper echoed in his mind. He ripped off the headphones and stumbled back, knocking over a stack of papers. The recording continued hissing faintly through the speakers until he slammed the power off. The silence that followed felt heavier than the whisper. Outside, the forest loomed. The elder towered above the fog, its presence unmistakable even in the dimness. For the first time, Elias wondered whether the quiet old-growth forest was truly silent, or whether he had simply been unable to hear what lay beneath its surface until now. He barely slept that night. Each time he drifted off, the words dragged him awake again, go home, as though the forest were speaking directly to him through the thin veil of his dreams. And beneath that whispering echo, he sensed something else. Something deeper. Something waiting for him below the cabin, below the roots, below the soil that had never been as still as it pretended to be. Something that had learned his name. Elias told himself that the forest wasn't truly warning him, that the words he'd heard through the soil microphone were a coincidence, a trick of the brain stitching patterns into noise. But as he descended the cabin steps the next morning, the cold silence that greeted him felt charged in a way he could not rationalize. The mist clung low to the ground, thicker than usual, removing depth from the landscape so that the forest appeared closer, as if the trees had crept toward the cabin during the night and stopped only when dawn pinned them in place. He brewed coffee out of habit, though the warmth did little to calm the tension braided inside his ribs. His equipment sat on the table, receiver, headphones, logs filled with careful handwriting. All the tools of a scientist. Yet when he looked at them that morning, they felt like talismans left behind by someone who no longer believed in their power. Still, routine mattered. He stepped outside, boots breaking patches of frosted moss, and made his way to the elder. The forest smelled different today, damp soil, cold fog, and beneath that, a faint sourness that reminded him of earth freshly turned after heavy rain. He knelt beside the main sensor cable, brushing away the layer of needles covering it. The soil here felt strangely warm against his palm. "Just geothermal variation," he whispered. But his voice sounded thin against the weight of the morning. He checked the cables, tightened the anchors, and returned to the cabin. The wind pushed lightly at the windows as though testing their resilience. Elias hesitated only a moment before putting the headphones back on. The channel clicked open. Static greeted him at first, soft, uneven, but beneath the static came the unmistakable low-frequency rumble of soil movement. He leaned forward. His breath caught. SCRH, SCRRR, the whispering rose again, but it was clearer now. Closer. More controlled. The words seemed to gather form from the distortion, shaping themselves inside his ears like someone molding wet clay. Mer, Ser. Elias's chest tightened. There it was again, his surname, dragged through grit and roots, spoken by something deep beneath the tree. He swallowed hard, adjusting the gain, trying to find a scientific explanation. But the sound that came next froze him completely. Elias. His name, fully formed this time. Soft. Breathless. Like someone lying beneath heavy earth, struggling to speak through packed soil. His fingers tightened around the dial. Who's there? The whisper stopped instantly, as if startled. Silence pressed against his eardrums, thick enough to hear his own pulse. Then, slowly, go home. Elias ripped the headphones off again, dropping them onto the counter. They swung for a moment from their cord, the faint static continuing in weak hisses. Okay, he muttered shakily, pacing in a tight circle. Okay. It's a misread. It's feedback between channels. Or a cross line. Or, he stopped. He knew he was lying to himself. He had spent half his life studying root acoustics, and nothing he had ever recorded behaved like this. No pattern recognition algorithm could have invented his name. No interference could have shaped the words the way that voice had. A colder thought slid into him then. What if the voice wasn't inside the equipment? What if the equipment was only the doorway? He stared at the cabin floor, at the wide planks darkened by damp air. The house stood on stilts. Beneath him lay hollow space, and soil. And roots. Thick ones. Very thick ones. He forced himself to breathe, but even breathing sounded loud in the small room, like something below might hear him. The rest of the day passed in a kind of strained watchfulness. Elias avoided the headphones, avoided the forest edge, avoided looking directly at the elder whose crown loomed constantly in his peripheral vision through the cabin windows. When dusk approached and the sky turned a muted indigo, he tried to busy himself with notes, rewriting diagrams, checking past data, but he could not keep his concentration. The silence between the trees had shifted again, tightening like a net. And then, as he sat at his desk trying to pretend he was still a man who understood the world, the cabin floor creaked. Not from settling wood, not from temperature shift. This creak had weight. Purpose. Direction. Elias turned slowly. Another creak sounded beneath him. Then a soft, unmistakable thump. Like something knocking gently against the underside of the cabin floorboards. He stood frozen, sweat beading at his hairline despite the cold. Another knock. 3 beats. Precise. The same rhythm he'd heard through the headphones. He backed away from the center of the room. No, he whispered. No. That's not. Another knock cut him off, this time beneath the far corner of the cabin. Then another near the steps. Moving. Following something. Following him. His stomach lurched. He bolted outside, slamming the door behind him so hard the hinges rattled. The forest air hit him like a cold cloth, damp, metallic. But the sound did not stop. Beneath the ground now, not the floor. Something shifting just under the soil line. Moving slowly. Deliberately. And moving toward him. Elias stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the rough bark of a cedar. The forest around him remained still, canopy unmoving. Yet beneath his feet he felt it, a faint tremor rippling through the topsoil like something dragging itself forward through roots and earth. A whisper rose up from the ground, muffled by dirt. Elias. He pressed his back to the tree, chest heaving. What do you want from me? The forest answered. Not above. Below. A long, shuddering groan traveled through the soil, vibrating upward into his spine. And then, you know. Elias clenched his teeth. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. But something deep inside him, something primal, instinctive, recognized the tone. It was not a threat. It was a summons. I'm not coming closer, he said, voice shaking. The tremor paused. Then, go home. His jaw tightened. This is my home now. The forest hummed, low, disapproving. Not yours. The ground beneath him vibrated harder, then stilled. And then, with a slowness that felt almost mournful, the voice faded, dissolving into a faint rasp and finally into the natural quiet of the woods. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound. Elias remained pressed against the cedar for a long time, trying to slow his shaking breath. Only when the sky darkened fully did he return to the cabin, locking the door despite knowing it did nothing against what lay beneath. That night he refused to put on the headphones. He tried reading, tried sleeping, tried ignoring the faint shifting beneath the cabin stilts. But at some point, near midnight, exhaustion dragged him into half-sleep. And that was when he heard it again. Not through the equipment. Not through the soil, but through the floorboards. A voice, soft and near, rising up between the planks with terrible clarity. Elias, come back. His eyes snapped open. He held his breath. The voice lingered, warm now, almost coaxing. You left, too soon. He stared at the dark ceiling. The cabin seemed to breathe around him. Come back to the roots. Elias covered his ears. The whisper seeped through his palms anyway. We remember, you. Something cold moved through his gut. The voice had changed. It no longer sounded like a stranger. It sounded familiar. Almost like his father's voice, rough, tired, calling him home when he was a boy. Tears gathered behind his eyes before he could stop them. No, he whispered. You're not him. The voice softened, crumbling with static and earth. Come home, Elias. His chest tightened painfully. Stop. Come home. Stop, please, go home. The last command struck him like a blow. A sob tore from his throat. Whose voice is that? He thought wildly. Is it mine? Is it all of theirs? He didn't know. But he knew the whisper no longer came from one voice. It came from many, layered, urgent, pleading. As if the entire network of roots beneath the elder had learned him, memorized him, and now spoke with a chorus of stolen tones. Elias curled onto his side, shaking, listening as the whispers ebbed into the ground again. The silence that followed was not relief. It was expectation. As if the forest were waiting for his decision. Outside, the elder stood in perfect stillness, its massive trunk rising like a pillar of ancient, indifferent memory. But beneath it, beneath the soil, beneath the cabin, beneath the entire valley, something moved. Something patient. Something that had not finished speaking. Elias stayed awake until dawn, knowing the truth with a clarity that hurt. The forest did not want him to leave. Not yet. And that meant the only way out was deeper in. Elias woke the next morning with the distinct sensation that someone had whispered into his ear while he slept, a soft, gritty breath brushing the side of his face. Yet when he jolted upright, heart pounding, the cabin was still, the cold morning air drifting through the cracked window in thin ribbons. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, rubbing his temples, trying to shake the lingering echo of the voice that seemed to cling to the inside of his skull like damp soil. When he finally stood and stepped onto the floorboards, the wood felt warmer than usual, as though the ground beneath the cabin had retained heat from something alive moving below. He froze, toes curling instinctively. And that was when he heard it, Without headphones, without equipment, just a faint vibration carried directly into the bones of his feet. SRRR, MMR. The whispering. Softer now, but unmistakable. He staggered back, nearly tripping over the bed frame. "No," he muttered breathlessly. "No, I'm not hearing it," but the truth settled over him like cold fog. The Re-K didn't need his equipment anymore. They had learned his attention. Found his frequency. Found him. He stepped outside into the brittle morning air, the fog still thick between the trunks, wrapping around the forest like a shroud. He tried focusing on something normal, the creak of the porch railing, the smell of pine sap, the familiar crunch of gravel under his boots, but beneath all of it he sensed movement. Deep movement, slow as tectonic plates. The elder towered over the ridge line, its massive crown silhouetted against the clouds like a cathedral carved by nature itself. Elias approached it cautiously, each step making the soil respond with small, muffled tremors, as though he were walking across the ribcage of some colossal creature. "I'm a scientist," he whispered to himself, as if saying it aloud might shield him. "I analyze. I observe. I don't believe in." His foot sank half an inch deeper into the ground as the soil beneath him shifted with a low, groaning hum. Elias froze. Should I run? The question flickered like a warning spark behind his ribs, but another thought, darker and heavier, pressed against it. Run where? The forest surrounded him for miles. The road into town wound through dense pines for nearly an hour. And the whispering had already followed him into the cabin. It would follow him anywhere. He approached the elder and placed a hand on its trunk. The bark was cold, colder than the air, colder than any tree had a right to be. He leaned in, listening with his ear against the rough wood. At first, he heard nothing but the faint echo of his own breath. Then, faintly, like something stirring in a deep well, Elias. He jerked back, stumbling. His breath fogged the air in frantic puffs. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No tree conducts, no organism, no acoustic medium, none of this should be." A sharp vibration beneath him cut off the denial. The soil directly at his feet pulsed upward, a single lurching heave, as though something beneath had rolled toward the surface. Elias staggered back and fell to his knees. His hands dug into the ground for balance, and froze. Because the soil here felt warm. Not just warm. Alive. Vibrating faintly with a rhythm that mirrored the pattern he'd mapped the night before. A rhythm that hadn't matched known root growth. A rhythm that until now he had believed was merely distorted seismic chatter. But now he felt it for what it was. Not growth. Not moisture shift. Breathing. Something beneath the elder's root network was breathing. Elias pushed himself away, crawling backward until he hit the exposed base of a fallen log. His heartbeat hammered inside his skull. "This place is wrong," he whispered. I need to see what's under here." The idea terrified him. But the alternative, leaving the whispers unanswered, felt worse. He grabbed a trowel and soil probe from the cabin shed and returned to the base of the elder, kneeling at the edge of a shallow hollow where the roots twisted like thick ropes. The ground here was softer, as if freshly disturbed. He pressed the trowel into the soil. It slid in too easily. The first few inches revealed nothing but dark earth. Then the soil texture changed, looser, clumpier, threaded with pale fibers that looked like fungal mycelium but felt too thick, too rigid. He brushed away more soil. His breath caught. Not fungus. Not root. Bone. A human rib, curved gracefully beneath the dirt, its surface stained with decades, even centuries, of earth. Elias gagged, stumbling back in horror. He stared at the half-exposed ribcage, trembling. "No," he whispered. No, this can't. There's no record, no burial site," the forest answered with a low, rumbling vibration that traveled up through the bones in the soil and into his own ribs. He scrambled forward, pushing away more earth with shaking hands. A skull emerged, half fused to a thick root that curled through the eye socket like a worm crawling through a cavity. The jaw hung open, soil filling the hollow where a voice once lived. Elias felt nausea rise sharply, but alongside it came something else, recognition. Not of the body, but of the pattern. The way the roots were wrapped around the ribs, the way they infiltrated the spine, the way the thickest root, nearly the width of his forearm, ran directly along the base of the skull like a second spine. The same vibration he'd heard beneath the cabin. The same frequency. The same pattern. "This is how," he whispered shakily. "This is how you learn to speak." The elder had grown around the bones, consumed them, translated their final vibrations into its own language. And now, as he listened, Elias understood the awful truth behind the voices. The tree wasn't mimicking the dead. The dead were speaking through the tree. As if to confirm it, the whisper rose again, soft, pleading, muffled by soil, "Elias, find us." Elias clutched his head, trying to block it out, but the whisper flowed through his bones, not his ears. The forest air thickened, the silence turning viscous. Somewhere beneath the elder, deeper than he had dug, more bones shifted, an entire graveyard woven into the root system like beads strung on a necklace. "How many?" he whispered, voice shaking. The root tremor answered, not in words, but in a rising chorus of vibrating tones that created the impression of a number too large to comprehend. Elias staggered back from the excavation site. His knees buckled. The world tilted. For a long moment he could only stare at the trees, his breath shallow, his thoughts unraveling like loose threads. "Why me?" The question came unbidden, quiet, fragile. The answer rose immediately beneath his feet, gentle, sorrowful, inevitable. "Because you hear us." Elias's pulse stuttered. He fell backward, landing hard on the forest floor. "I didn't want to hear you," he whispered. "But you do." "I just study roots, soil, acoustics," we called, "and you listened." "I didn't listen," he cried. The forest pulsed. "You did." His throat tightened. He looked around wildly at the trees, every trunk suddenly feeling like an eye, every branch like a hand reaching down toward him. "I have to leave," he whispered. "I need to leave." The whisper that rose in response was colder. Firmer. Final. "You can't." Elias froze. The air seemed to drain from the space around him. The ground trembled, softly at first, then with rising insistence, like the shift of something enormous turning over in its sleep. The soil beneath his feet rippled with a subtle undulation that traveled outward in concentric waves, away from the elder, toward the forest edge, toward the cabin, toward every inch of land under the ancient canopy. "You are part of us now." Elias shook his head violently. "No, I won't." The vibration intensified. The roots beneath him thrummed with a different rhythm now, not pleading, not calling, but pulling. "Come, home." The word home hit him harder this time, echoing inside his chest like a memory he didn't want. His father's voice calling him from across a dark yard. His mother's voice waking him gently on winter mornings. Voices the tree had stolen. Voices the tree now wore like borrowed masks. Elias stumbled to his feet and ran, blindly, wildly, branches whipping against his coat as he crashed through the underbrush. But the whispers followed him, blooming up through the soil with every stride. "Elias. Elias, come home." He didn't know whether they meant the cabin, or the forest, or the grave. He only knew the roots knew his name. And now he knew theirs. Elias ran until his lungs burned, until the sting of cold air scraped the back of his throat raw and his boots slipped on moss-like stones, but no matter how fast he pushed himself through the dense Oregon undergrowth, he could feel the ground moving with him, matching him, its subtle tremors traveling beneath his feet like a second heartbeat pounding up from the earth. He crashed through a curtain of ferns and stumbled into a small clearing, gasping, staring in horror as the soil buckled in. slow ripple that traveled outward from the direction of the elder. It was impossible. Roots did not move like this, not in this time scale, not in response to a single human, but Elias knew better now. The elder wasn't operating on normal biology. It was operating on desire. On memory. On the sum of all the voices it had swallowed. He backed away until his spine hit the trunk of another fir, smaller and younger, but even that tree trembled faintly beneath his touch as though it too belonged to the elder's network, its veins wired to the same dark intelligence. Please, Elias choked, palms pressed to the tree's bark, breath fogging sharply in the cold air. I'm not one of you. I'm not meant to be. A low vibration rolled beneath the earth, not violent, not sudden, but deep enough to shake loose a shower of needles from the branches above him. Stay with us. The words didn't come from a single point. They rose from the entire clearing, breathed up through the soil like steam escaping cracks in hot stone. Elias stumbled backward and nearly fell, hands shaking uncontrollably. No, he whispered. No, no, why are you doing this? The ground answered with a tremor so soft he almost mistook it for his own heartbeat. Because you hear us. I don't want to, he shouted. The whisper continued anyway, we hear you too. Elias clamped his hands over his ears, but the voice vibrated through his bones, bypassing flesh entirely. He spun and ran toward the cabin, branches snapping behind him like brittle fingers grasping at the air. By the time he reached the narrow trail leading up the hill, the fog had thickened into something almost corporeal, clinging to his clothes as though trying to hold him back. The cabin appeared through the haze like a ghost, tilted, lonely, fragile against the towering black silhouettes of the trees. Elias stumbled up the steps, shoved the door shut behind him, and locked it, though it felt absurdly symbolic. A thin wooden door meant nothing to something that moved through the earth itself. Inside, the cabin was dark, too dark, shadows clung to the corners like wet moss. Elias flicked on a lamp, its sickly yellow glow struggling to fill the space. He pressed his back against the door, chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked bursts. Think, he whispered. Just think. He moved to his desk, flipping through his notes with trembling hands. Charts, diagrams, seismic readings, so much data, yet none of it explained the way the root system behaved like a living archive of voices. None of it explained why it had singled him out. His eyes darted across audio spectrograms marked with shaky notations, pattern repeats, voice-like harmonics, possible mimic. And beneath one graph he'd scribbled something in the middle of the night without remembering, it knows my name. The cabin creaked then. Not from wind. From below. Elias froze. The floorboards beneath his boots swelled upward, no more than the width of a fingernail, but enough. Enough to signal movement beneath the house. Something dragging itself slowly, patiently, across the soil under the stilts. Elias backed away from the floor, knocking over a stack of books. Please, he whispered, voice trembling. Please stop. The whisper that rose through the boards was softer now, gentle, coaxing, soaked in centuries of persuasive sorrow. You belong, stay, with us. Elias shook his head violently. I belong to nothing here. I'm leaving tomorrow. The whisper paused. Then, we waited, for you. Elias felt sick. Waited, why? The wood under his feet vibrated with the faint murmur of countless buried voices, rising and falling like shallow breaths. Because, you hear the ground. I study it. That's all we need. The tremor beneath him grew steadier, more deliberate. The floor vibrated in a slow pattern, 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses, like a coded knock. Elias stepped away from the center of the room, toward the wall where he'd stacked old research crates. His foot brushed something that cracked softly. He crouched, lifting a loose floorboard. Beneath it, the soil bulged upward in a way it hadn't before, like something beneath had pressed against the wood, forcing it loose. Swallowing hard, he brushed aside handfuls of dirt. A shape emerged. Then another. He scraped away more earth, heart pounding. Bones. A hand first, small, delicate, fused to the roots that wrapped around it like vines that had been waiting centuries for purchase. The fingers curled slightly, held in place by tendrils of pale, woody fibers. Elias recoiled, covering his mouth as bile rose in his throat. He kept digging. He didn't know why. Perhaps he needed proof. Perhaps part of him already knew the truth and needed to see it to believe it. Beneath the hand lay a forearm. Then a shoulder. Then the curve of a skull intertwined with a massive root thicker than his wrist. But this skull was different from the one near the elder. Something about it was wrong. The bone was soft. Soft enough that the pressure of his thumb caused a slight indentation. "What?" he whispered, breath trembling. "Bones shouldn't be soft. Not after death. Not after centuries. Unless something had drained them, softer than chalk. Like the minerals had been sucked clean. Digested." He reached for the skull with shaking fingers, but the moment he touched it, a wave of sound roared through him so violently he slammed backward into the wall. Not external sound. Internal. Like a dying breath exploding behind his eyes. For a second, a single, unbearable second, he was the buried voice inhaling dirt instead of air. He felt the weight of the soil. The crushing pressure on his chest. The cold slip of roots threading themselves around bone. "Not alone," the voice gasped inside him. Elias screamed. The cabin blurred. The sound vanished as quickly as it had come. He scrambled backward across the floor, gasping for breath. "I'm leaving," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "I'm leaving tonight, I don't care." The whisper rose through the cabin floor with a sudden sharpness, cutting him off mid-sentence. "No." Elias froze. "You stay with us." The floorboards bowed upward slightly, dust drifting from the seams. Something pushed against the underside of the cabin, something thick and slow and powerful, the main root. The one he had sensed but never seen. He crawled toward the door, but halfway there the cabin tilted slightly with a groaning noise, as though the very stilts were being nudged from beneath. The whisper deepened, layered with tones he hadn't heard before, a chorus of agony, longing, and hunger braided into one impossible voice. "We waited, we waited, we waited." Through the window he saw the elder standing motionless, its silhouette carved against the sunset like the spine of an ancient beast. He reached the porch door, hands fumbling with the lock. The key slipped from his trembling fingers. He bent down to grab it, and felt something through the wood. A pulse. A slow, powerful throb. As if the main root lay directly under the front step, waiting for him. Elias snatched the key, unlocked the door, and ran outside, stumbling down the steps, but froze on the final plank. Because the ground before him rippled. A long, slow undulation in the soil. The same root he had felt beneath the cabin. Rising, following him. He stepped back. The root pushed farther upward, its knotted outline visible beneath the thin layer of earth. Like a spine shifting under skin. A sound drifted up from it, a whisper of breath through soil. "Stay with us, let us speak, let us breathe." Elias backed away, shaking uncontrollably. "I don't want this," he whispered. "I don't want to be part of you." The whisper softened into something terrifyingly tender. "We know, but we do." Elias turned and ran into the forest, the wrong direction, farther from the road, deeper into the elder's territory, because every direction felt like a trap anyway. And as he ran, the ground moved with him. Keeping pace. Keeping shape. Keeping intention. You hear us, come home." Elias didn't know when he began crying. Only that he couldn't stop. And every tear that fell onto the soil seemed to vibrate with an answering tremor, as if the earth itself were tasting his fear. For the first time, Elias understood, the root system wasn't hunting him, it was welcoming him. Claiming him. preparing him. And the forest would not let him go without first finishing what it had begun in the dark beneath the elder. He ran deeper into the trees. And the roots followed. Closer. Closer. As though waiting for the moment he would fall still, and listen completely. Elias didn't remember when he stopped running and began simply moving, no longer sprinting in panic but stumbling in a slow, broken rhythm as if the forest itself had matched his exhaustion and was now guiding him gently, insistently, toward a single point in the endless darkness of the Oregon undergrowth. The fog thickened with every step, swallowing the trunks of the trees until they became nothing more than pillars of shadow rising into a canopy he could no longer see. His breath shuddered in uneven gasps, his legs trembled violently, and still the ground followed him, rippling in low waves beneath the carpet of needles and moss. The forest was hurting him. Persuading him. Closing every exit. At some point he realized he was circling back, returning not to the cabin, but to the elder. The ancient tree rose from the mist like the spine of a submerged giant emerging from deep water, its silhouette immense and silent, its branches unmoving even in the cold wind. Elias stopped at the edge of its massive root flare, panting, staring at the place where he had uncovered the ribcage fused to the roots. The soil there looked disturbed again, freshly so, as if someone had been digging since his last visit. Or something. "Please," Elias whispered, voice cracking. "I'm not supposed to be here. I don't belong here." The ground beneath him trembled in reply, gentle, almost affectionate. "You do now." He shook his head violently. "No, you came, you listened. Because it's my job. I study, you hear, deeper, than others. Stop, you hear, the lost ones." A cold wind moved through the clearing then, and Elias could swear he felt fingers, cold, brittle, weightless, brush the side of his neck. He spun, heart slamming against his ribs. Nothing stood behind him. But when he looked down, the soil at his feet had cracked. A fissure no wider than a coin opened slowly, and from within that dark line came a faint glow, dim and pulsing like a dying ember. Elias swallowed hard. The root was rising closer to the surface. He took one step back, but the soil rose with him, buckling softly like breath pushing upward from a buried chest. "Don't run." Elias clutched at his coat, struggling to keep his voice steady. "What do you want from me?" The answer rose from beneath him like a sigh exhaled through centuries of packed earth, "To remember, through you." He staggered. I can't carry any of this." The whisper deepened, harmonizing with layers of voices he could not separate, women, men, children, all blurred into one mournful tone. "We carried it, now you will." Elias pressed his palms to his ears, shaking. "Stop, please, stop," but the voices swelled, rising through the soil like steam beneath cracking stone. "Listen." "No, listen." The forest fell abruptly silent. Every insect, every breath of wind, every distant groan of shifting branches faded until only the sound beneath the ground remained, a low, resonant hum that settled into Elias's bones. And then, with unbearable clarity, the voice emerged again, "Elias," a sudden shout, raw and jagged. Elias gasped, stumbling backward. That voice, it was his. His own voice. But not spoken through his mouth. Spoken through the ground. His own terror, thrown back at him like an echo trapped beneath centuries of earth. "No, no, no, no," he whispered, shaking violently. Then the voice came again, louder, "Elias. Help me." He fell to his knees, gripping his head as the soil trembled beneath him. That voice. That was him. But distorted. Buried. Dying. Echoing back from below as though he were hearing the sound of his own death broadcast through the roots. "Stop," he screamed. "Stop it." But the root didn't stop. The ground heaved, a low swelling motion that broke the thin layer of moss and needles. A thick shape pushed upward from the soil, slowly, heavily, like a massive limb waking from deep sleep. Elias scrambled back, but not far. He couldn't be far. The forest had formed a ring of silence around him. The shape emerged fully now, a root thicker than any he had seen, pale where the other roots were dark, its surface textured like weathered bone. It curved toward him, soil falling from it in small avalanches. Elias stared at the shape, breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a root. Not anymore. Over centuries, maybe longer, it had fused with bone. Not as parasite. As partner. Bits of rib, vertebrae, fragments of skull, all woven into a lattice of living wood. A spine made of tree and man. And woman and child, Elias realized with a sinking dread. The root, this monstrous, ancient thing, was a choir of bodies long consumed, long remembered. Touch us, the whispers breathed. No, touch us. The root shifted, stretching toward him. Elias tried to crawl away, but the ground beneath him rose slightly, nudging him closer. Every inch he moved, the soil corrected him, guiding him toward the massive pale root. Please, he whispered, but even he didn't know if he was begging to escape or begging not to be alone anymore. Touch us, hear us, be with us. The root stopped inches from his trembling hand. The air trembled around it, humming with the layered voices of centuries. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. No, no, touch. He didn't know whether the ground tilted or whether his arm moved involuntarily, but his palm brushed the root. And the world inhaled sharply. A shock traveled up his arm, not electric but organic, like cold water rushing through hollow bone. Elias cried out, collapsing forward as the forest tilted around him. The root pulsed. And with a deep, cavernous resonance, the chorus of voices shifted. They aligned. They sharpened. They merged. Into one sound. One scream. Elias's scream. Echoed back at him from below the earth in a dozen tones, older, younger, deeper, hollow, until it no longer sounded like a single man but like an entire graveyard calling out in one voice. Elias, the ground beneath him buckled. His vision flickered. He felt something pull at him, not physically, not yet, but through the center of his mind, tugging gently, insistently, unraveling the boundary between his thoughts and the echo under the soil. The root pulsed again. And the voices began to braid themselves with his. He heard memories that weren't his, someone dying in the cold, someone lost in the woods, someone calling for help that never came. He felt fear that wasn't his. He felt loneliness that wasn't his. He felt centuries. And then, he felt himself. Split. Diluted. Pulled apart. Thread by thread. Becoming vibration. Becoming memory. Becoming whisper. Becoming root. His breath hitched. He tried to pull his hand away, but the root tightened, not physically, but within his nerves, anchoring him to its rhythm. Stay, stay, become. And no, his lips barely formed the sound. The forest dimmed. His vision tunneled. His voice rose again, involuntarily, raw, desperate. And beneath him, the earth echoed it instantly. Elias, he felt himself inside that echo, trapped within the vibrations, unable to distinguish where his scream ended and the root's memory began. His final clear thought was a simple, fragile realization: the root didn't mimic the dead. It added them. The soil closed around him, not crushing, but enclosing, accepting, like the soft press of hands guiding him downward. His eyes drifted shut. The whisper filled him, filled everything. You are home. And as the ancient roots curled around his fading consciousness like careful fingers, Elias Mercer exhaled one final, trembling breath. Moments later, the forest fell still. The elder stood silent. The fog drifted. But beneath the soil, beneath the tangled marrow of tree and bone, a new voice joined the chorus, soft at first, then growing steadily clearer as it echoed through the vast subterranean network of roots. Not a warning. Not a plea. Merely, memory. Elias's memory. Folded into the earth. Waiting for someone else to listen. Story 4. Evelyn Hartwell had grown accustomed to the quiet routines of the grand old house on the cliff, that sprawling estate where ocean wind pressed against the windows every night like a restless spirit begging for entry. She often wandered its dim hallways long after midnight, fingertips grazing the carved banisters, listening to the faint echo of her own footsteps as though testing whether she was still alive or merely another ghost among the portraits that lined the walls. Her husband, Arthur, once a titan of industry and now a frail man whittled down by an illness no doctor could name, lay asleep in the master bedroom at the far end of the hall, his breath shallow, his skin nearly translucent in the lamplight. Evelyn watched him sometimes in the long stillness of the early hours, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest the way a child memorizes the ticking of a clock, aware that each breath was a step closer to the inevitable. She was 34. He was 68. Their marriage had not been a romance, not at first, not in the way stories described love blooming like spring beneath sunlight. It had been a union of needs, she a starving artist with talent but no patrons, he a widower craving companionship and someone to soften the harsh emptiness of his wealth. Yet over time, affection had crept in quietly, like ivy claiming an unguarded wall. She had grown to love the way he hummed old jazz standards under his breath, the way he insisted on bringing her tea each morning despite the tremor in his hands, the way he looked at her paintings as though he could see something inside them she had not realized she put there. And now he was dying. Slowly. Painfully. The illness consumed him with a patience that felt crueler than any sudden tragedy. Evelyn could paint his suffering in her sleep, the gaunt cheeks, the sunken eyes, the hollowed temples, and sometimes she did. Her sketchbooks were filled with studies of Arthur, each more intimate and unbearable than the last. But she had not painted a full portrait of him, not yet. Arthur always asked her to, "When you're ready, Evie," but she never found the courage. A final portrait felt too much like saying goodbye. And then, one night, the choice was taken from her. It was near 2 a.m. when it happened, the kind of hour where the world feels suspended, where walls breathe more loudly than people. Evelyn had gone down to the kitchen for tea, her mind too tangled with worry to sleep, when she noticed a sliver of darkness along the back hallway, darker than the shadows around it, as though absorbing rather than reflecting the dim light. At first she assumed it was a trick of her overtired eyes or the flicker of the dying wall sconce. But as she stepped closer, the shadow shifted. Not away from the light, but toward her. She froze, tea mug trembling in her hands. Is someone there? The shadow held its shape, a long, impossibly narrow silhouette draped against the far wall like a stain from another world. And then it spoke. Its voice was neither deep nor high, neither male nor female. It was like the rustle of silk over stone, like pages turning in an empty library. You seek more time. Evelyn's throat tightened. What? The shadow stepped forward, or rather, it unfolded from the wall, peeling itself away from the darkness in a movement too fluid to be human. Its edges wavered like smoke bound by invisible lines, no face. No features. Only the faint suggestion of form. Time, it repeated. To finish your work. Evelyn backed away, hitting the edge of the counter. Who are you? Someone who can offer what you desire. Its voice curled around her, slipping into her ears like a secret she had once known as a child but forgotten. More time, it murmured. For your masterpiece. Evelyn shook her head. I haven't agreed to anything. But you will. The figure drifted closer, stopping just outside arm's reach. The man upstairs suffers. Each breath steals from you the chance to capture what you love before it fades. Her pulse quickened. Arthur is dying, she whispered. I know. Are you a doctor? The shadow chuckled, a sound like paper cracking. No. But I can give him strength. Days. Weeks. Enough for you to paint what you have always been afraid to finish. Evelyn tightened her grip on the mug. And the cost? The figure tilted its head slowly, as though amused she'd thought to ask. A life for a life. When the masterpiece is done, so is he. But not before. Evelyn's breath hitched. You mean, Arthur lives while I paint? He lives until you finish. Until the last brushstroke dries. Evelyn's thoughts splintered. The offer felt obscene. Terrible. Impossible. And yet the image bloomed unbidden in her mind, Arthur standing again beside her easel, steady, warm, humming softly as he watched her work, Arthur's smile returning while she sketched his features one last time, Arthur's voice whispering her name without the rattle of death beneath each syllable. No, she whispered. I can't choose that. You already have. Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. The figure extended a hand, or something shaped like one, its outline quivering faintly, the way candlelight trembles over a windowpane. Say yes, it murmured. And he will wake in the morning. And when the portrait is finished, he will sleep. Easily. Easily. The words struck her like a blow. Arthur had not known ease for months. Every breath was a battle, every dawn felt like theft. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears welling. Was it mercy? Or selfishness? Her hands shook. Her voice barely formed the word. Yes. The shadow inhaled, or seemed to, the darkness around it tightening. Then paint. Evelyn blinked, and the figure vanished. The hallway returned to its normal dimness, though it now felt emptier, as though the air itself had been hollowed out. Her tea had gone cold in her hands. The next morning Arthur woke humming. Evelyn nearly dropped the tray of breakfast she carried when she saw him sitting up, color returned to his cheeks, eyes bright in a way she hadn't seen in months. Evie, he said softly. You look like you've seen a ghost. She tried to speak but could only shake her head as he reached for her hand with steady fingers. It's a good morning, he said, smiling the smile she had feared was gone forever. She wept silently as she held him, her tears dampening his nightshirt. And that afternoon, when Arthur insisted she bring her easel into the sunroom so he could sit for her, it's finally time, Evie, he said gently. Evelyn set up her paints with trembling hands. Every stroke she placed on the canvas felt like both salvation and betrayal. Arthur laughed softly whenever she grew frustrated with a shadow or angle. Start again, darling, time is all we have now, and she pretended not to hear the cruel truth embedded in the words. Late that night, long after Arthur had fallen asleep in his armchair, Evelyn stepped back from the canvas and examined what she had begun. Her breath caught. At first it looked perfect, gentle strokes capturing the warmth of her husband's face. But as she leaned closer, the shadows beneath his chin seemed off, too dark, too hollow. And around his eyes, a faint tint of gray-green muddled the skin, like bruising beneath the surface. She blinked. Leaned closer. Her heart stuttered. The paint was changing. She hadn't mixed those colors. She hadn't painted those shadows. And yet they spread slowly across the canvas, like rot blooming in slow motion. She touched the edge of the portrait with trembling fingers. The paint was cold, almost damp. And somewhere in the house, far down the hallway, she heard a faint cough from Arthur's room. Evelyn drew her hand back from the canvas. In the wavering lamplight, the painted Arthur seemed to shimmer, and for a heartbeat too long, she thought she saw his painted mouth curl upward. Into a smile. A smile Arthur hadn't worn in months. A smile that didn't belong to anything alive. Evelyn stepped away slowly, her pulse thundering in her ears as the shadowy hallway behind her thickened, as though the figure from the night before lingered just out of sight. The deal had begun. And the house felt suddenly, irrevocably, aware of her choice. Evelyn did not sleep the night after she accepted the bargain. She lay awake in the dim guest room adjoining the sunroom, staring at the ceiling while her mind churned with the impossible truth of what had happened. The figure in the hallway, the promise whispered like a secret slipped under a locked door, the eerie strength that had returned to Arthur's failing body. When dawn finally seeped through the curtains in a pale wash of color, she rose with the heaviness of someone walking through water and drifted into the sunroom, where Arthur was already awake, humming softly as he poured tea. The mug shook slightly in her hands as she approached him, But Arthur seemed oblivious, almost buoyant, as though someone had wound life back into him overnight. "You look exhausted, Evie," he said, stepping forward to brush his knuckles against her cheek. His touch was warm. Firm. Stronger than it had been in months. "You've been working too hard." She stared at his hand, at the steady way he held the teapot, at the faint flush of pink returning to his skin. He looked younger. Not younger in any supernatural way, but younger in spirit, lighter, freer, as if the illness that had hollowed him out had simply decided to loosen its grip. It should have comforted her. Instead, Evelyn felt a cold thread of guilt unravel slowly through her stomach. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice cracked gently on the last word. Arthur smiled and kissed her temple before taking his seat beside the window. "Come, darling," he said warmly. "You should paint while the light is still soft." The sunroom was her favorite place in the house, glass on 3 walls, a view of the cliff and the restless ocean beyond, and morning light that always seemed to hold a golden stillness. She set up her easel quietly, mixing colors with slow, deliberate motions. Arthur watched her with a fondness that made her heart ache. "I've missed seeing you work," he said softly. "It brings life into this place." She forced a smile. "Then I'll try my best today." As she raised her brush to the canvas, she felt the faintest tremor of hesitation. The first stroke was always the hardest. It defined direction, mood, fate. She breathed in slowly, letting the salt-heavy ocean air fill her lungs. Then she touched the brush to the canvas. The stroke came easily, smooth, fluid, familiar in a way that comforted her. This was what she understood, what she could control: paint, light, shadow, the delicate structure of a face. But as she continued to sketch Arthur's outline, she sensed something else stirring beneath the surface, not physically, but emotionally, a low hum of unease resonating from the back of her mind like a note plucked from a hidden instrument. She pushed it aside and focused instead on Arthur's eyes. They had always been her favorite part of him, the quiet intelligence, the humor buried in the creases, the gentleness behind the gray. She painted slowly, capturing that warmth. The light outside shifted like a living thing, casting shadows across his features that danced across the canvas as she worked. Time blurred. Hours passed. When she finally stepped back to stretch her cramped fingers, she realized Arthur had fallen asleep in the armchair, his breathing deep and steady. She smiled faintly. It was easy to pretend, in moments like this, that the bargain had never happened, that Arthur's miraculous recovery was nothing more than a stroke of luck. But when she turned back to the canvas, the illusion shattered. Something on the painting had changed. She leaned closer, frowning. The shadows beneath Arthur's chin had deepened, not with the rich, warm brown she'd mixed earlier, but with a dull, sickly green-gray, the color of bruised flesh or damp rot. She hadn't painted that. She would never paint that. Her fingers hovered an inch from the canvas, trembling. She waited for her mind to catch up, to rationalize, to explain. But the truth sat heavy and unavoidable beneath her ribs. The painting is changing on its own. She dipped a brush in the lighter pigment to correct the shadow, but as soon as the bristles touched the canvas, the darker color underneath shifted, absorbing the new paint like soil drinking rain. She jerked back. A cold gasp escaped her. Arthur stirred in his sleep, his fingers twitching slightly as though responding to some distant discomfort. Evelyn stepped between him and the painting instinctively, as though shielding him from something she barely understood. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the painting seemed to darken with it. She stared at the portrait, heart pounding, watching as the faintest suggestion of discoloration spread across the cheekbone, nothing obvious, nothing grotesque, but unmistakably wrong, like something underneath the painted flesh was beginning to rot. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. Please, not yet." Her voice cracked on the last word, echoing through the empty sunroom. Arthur shifted again, adjusting his arm, letting out a soft sigh. Evelyn could barely breathe. She forced herself to clean her brushes with steady hands, all the while refusing to look at the portrait. She didn't want to see what else might have changed. When Arthur woke, the last rays of daylight washed gently over him. "Did you finish for today?" he asked, stretching slightly and smiling at her. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Yes," she lied. "You look tired too." He chuckled softly. "I feel better than I have in years." She helped him back to their bedroom, tucking him under the quilt. He fell asleep almost immediately, breathing peacefully. Evelyn lingered by the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth as she watched him. She wanted to believe he was safe. She wanted to believe she had saved him. But the truth curled around her like cold smoke as she walked back to the sunroom. The portrait waited for her in the dimming light. She approached it slowly, like one might approach a caged animal. When she finally reached it, her breath stopped. The discoloration had spread. Not dramatically, just enough to hollow one cheek, to add a faint bruise beneath the painted eye, to disturb the symmetry of his face in the way illness does when it begins to reclaim a body. "No," she whispered again, tears forming. That wasn't the deal. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. The figure in the hallway had never promised healing. It had promised time. Time to finish the masterpiece. And that was all. The cost, the true cost, was beginning to reveal itself. She touched the bottom corner of the frame, her fingers brushing against dried paint that felt colder than it should have. "I don't want him to suffer," she murmured. The portrait looked back at her with an expression she hadn't painted, an almost imperceptible curve of the mouth, too faint to be a smile, too sharp to be benign. She stepped away. The room felt suddenly smaller. The air denser. As she extinguished the lamps one by one, she felt watched, not by Arthur, not by the house, but by the unfinished portrait. In the darkness, the last glint of fading light caught on the painted eyes, and for a heartbeat too long, she thought she saw them flicker. Evelyn backed out of the room, trembling. When she finally closed the door, the faint echo of laughter, dry, papery, skeletal, brushed the edge of her hearing like a memory she wished she hadn't awakened. And she knew, the portrait was no longer hers. It had become the bargain's. She just hadn't paid the full price yet. The next week unfolded with a strange, dreamlike monotony, as if the house itself had slipped into a new rhythm, one calibrated not to Arthur's faltering mortality, but to the steady progression of the portrait on Evelyn's easel. Every morning, Arthur woke with a vigor that seemed borrowed from some forgotten youth, humming as he shaved, joking as he tied the robe around his once withered frame. And every afternoon Evelyn painted him, her brush guiding itself through motions she didn't entirely control. At first the routine soothed her. Routine always had. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in knowing what each hour would bring. But the comfort began to rot almost immediately, just like the painting. It was subtle at first. The third morning, Evelyn noticed the faint hollowing of the painted jawline, the way the color beneath the skin seemed to bruise, as though the portrait were decaying from the inside out. She tried correcting it, but the paint resisted her touch, swallowing pigments whole, muddying them into that same dull gray that reminded her of mold blooming beneath old wallpaper. On the fifth day, the throat in the painting developed a shadow, an odd, asymmetrical swelling that looked disturbingly like a tumor. She hadn't painted it. She would never paint it. And yet there it was, blooming silently with the kind of invasive wish that only illness or dark magic could manifest. Arthur, meanwhile, had never looked better. His cheeks were warm with color. His laugh, always a soft, tired rumble, now crackled with genuine joy. He ate full meals, moved through the house with energy he hadn't shown in years, and frequently kissed Evelyn's cheek in the way he used to when they were newly married. And yet, each moment of health he gained felt like a grain of sand slipping from her grasp, funneling through some unseen hourglass whose shape she didn't dare imagine. She watched him sometimes when he wasn't looking. His movements didn't feel entirely natural. They felt rehearsed, as if someone, somewhere, were pulling unseen strings to animate him. The guilt she had buried deep within her ribs grew sharper, heavier, and each day the portrait reflected that guilt with increasing grotesque honesty. One afternoon, as the light waned into a dull gray shimmer behind the fog, Evelyn dipped her brush into a warm chestnut shade, intending to add depth to the curve of Arthur's arm in the portrait. But when she turned the brush, she froze. A thin fissure had formed along the painted wrist, a hairline crack that widened with terrible softness, like a bone breaking in slow motion. "No," Evelyn whispered, reaching out her fingers to gently press against the crack. The paint around it was cold. Wet. Alive. She pulled her hand back sharply, cradling her palm against her chest. Behind her, Arthur, a living, breathing Arthur, shifted in his seat. "Everything all right, Evie?" he asked kindly, his voice warm with concern she didn't deserve. She nodded stiffly, forcing a smile. "Yes. Just fixing a detail." But she didn't return to the painting immediately. Instead, she walked around it, studying it as though she might puzzle out the truth through mere observation. The crack on the wrist had begun to branch into an intricate network of fissures, reaching toward the painted elbow like veins running dry. A faint smell drifted from the canvas, so subtle she almost missed it, the sour earthiness of a damp cellar, the scent of something growing wrong in the dark. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Arthur," she said softly, "do you feel well?" He smiled up at her, his eyes warm and bright. "Better than I have in years," he said gently. "This is the happiest I've been in a long time." She stared at him, struggling with a storm of emotions, relief tangled with fear, love knotted with guilt, hope poisoned by the knowledge that every moment she painted drew him closer to the trade she had made. The shadowed figure had promised time. It had never promised healing. Healing was an illusion, one that Arthur was living only because she dipped her brush into the bargain each morning. That night, after Arthur fell asleep in the sunroom chair, because he insisted he wanted to watch her paint until the last flicker of daylight vanished, Evelyn stayed behind. The house grew darker, its wooden bones settling with soft groans. The waves crashed far below the cliff, rhythmic, relentless. She approached the portrait with dread. In the dim light of the single lamp, the painted Arthur looked wrong. His eyes, though she had painted them with warmth, now glinted with something sharp and glacial beneath the layers of pigment. The shadows beneath them had grown darker, more sunken, as though the canvas were hollowing itself from within. She leaned in, heart pounding. The painted mouth had changed. Not dramatically, just enough that the corners tilted upward into an eerie, ambiguous expression. A smirk. A taunt. A secret. Evelyn staggered backward, knocking over a jar of brushes. They scattered across the wooden floor with a clatter. As she bent to pick them up, the air in the sunroom chilled suddenly, as though a window had opened, not to the outside, but to some cold void leaking into the room. And then she felt it, a presence behind her. Not touching. Just standing. Watching. She didn't turn at first. She couldn't. Fear rooted her in place. But eventually, with her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs, she forced herself to look over her shoulder. The shadow figure from the hallway stood in the far corner of the room, an ink-dark silhouette against the pale moonlight filtering through the glass. It hadn't changed. Still faceless, still impossibly thin, still rippling faintly like smoke trapped beneath glass. "You are falling behind," it whispered, its voice fluttering like brittle paper. Evelyn straightened slowly, clutching a brush like a weapon though she knew it could do nothing against something made of shadow and promise. "The painting is changing," she whispered hoarsely. "I didn't do that." "Of course you didn't." The figure drifted closer, its form shrinking slightly as though condensing itself to slip through the air. "The painting reflects his truth." Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. "But he's healthy." "His body," the figure murmured, "is a borrowed vessel. But the portrait reveals the soul." "The debt." "Debt?" she whispered. "You traded his remaining suffering for hours of life. You traded his natural end for time to finish your masterpiece." Evelyn's breath faltered. "I didn't. I didn't mean to hurt him. You cannot pull two threads without unraveling something." The figure glided closer, finished the painting. And if I don't? The shadow tilted its head. Then the bargain ends early. Evelyn's stomach lurched. Early? Yes, it purred. He will collapse into the death you delayed. And you will lose your chance. Your time. Evelyn tightened her grip on the brush until her knuckles whitened. You said he would live until the painting was done. He will, the figure replied softly. If you keep painting. Evelyn felt her knees weaken. You're forcing me. No, the figure murmured. You chose this. I simply enforce choices. She backed away, breath catching in her throat. I want to leave this room. Then go. The shadow leaned closer, the air around it crackling softly like parchment in flame. But the painting will call you back. It always does. And with that, it dissolved, melting into the darker corners of the sunroom, retreating until nothing but cold remained. Evelyn stood alone. She tried to step toward the door. She managed 3 steps before a pressure, subtle, invisible, tightened around her ribs. Not painful. Just persuasive. Just enough to make her turn back toward the canvas. The portrait stared at her with hollowing eyes. Evelyn dropped the brush. Her hands shook violently. And in the quiet of that vast, echoing house on the cliff, she understood something with terrible, sinking certainty. She wasn't trapped in the room yet. But she soon would be. And every stroke she painted brought her closer not only to Arthur's end, but to her own. By the time the 11th day arrived, Evelyn felt as though the house itself had begun to tilt, not physically, but emotionally, leaning its weight toward the sunroom the same way grief shifts a person's center of gravity until standing upright becomes a negotiation between will and collapse. She barely slept anymore, barely ate, drifting through the hallways like a restless echo, always returning to the portrait as though pulled by threads knotted inside her chest. Arthur noticed her exhaustion, of course he did. He was always gentle, always perceptive, but even his tender concern had begun to feel uncanny in recent days, as if some invisible hand guided his words to mirror the version of himself he had once been. He smiled too brightly. He laughed too readily. And at times, when he fell asleep in his armchair during her sessions, his expression slackened into something that resembled not rest, but vacancy, like someone wearing his body as a mask. Evelyn tried to ignore it. Tried to lose herself in the familiar comfort of paint and canvas. But each day the portrait grew worse, and each day Arthur's body grew healthier. Their lives were diverging, his into a cruel imitation of vitality, hers into an ever-deepening well of dread. On the 11th afternoon, she approached the canvas and froze. Overnight, a patch of the painted Arthur's skin had bubbled, not dramatically, just enough to warp the texture like meat beginning to spoil. She reached toward the canvas with trembling fingers, feeling a sick twist in her stomach when the paint dented beneath her touch, soft and yielding like overripe fruit. Evie. Arthur's voice floated from behind her, warm as a hearth fire. She jerked her hand away. Yes. He entered the room with a carefully measured smile, the way he always had when he wanted her to believe everything was fine. You look pale, he said softly. Have you been eating? She nodded even though she hadn't. It's just the light, she lied. Arthur stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. His fingers were warm. Steady. But when she looked up into his eyes, something in their depth felt hollow, like a well whose water had been drained, leaving only the reflection of a sky that wasn't hers. Evie, he murmured, brushing her hair back, I want you to rest. You push yourself too hard. The tenderness in his voice pierced her like a blade. She both loved and feared him in that moment, and the fear wasn't of Arthur, never him, it was of whatever allowed him to stand here like this, defying his own mortality. She forced a smile. I just want to do you justice. His hand tightened slightly. You always have. She turned back to the canvas to hide the sting of tears. But Arthur lingered behind her, watching the portrait with a quietness that prickled her skin. Evie, he whispered eventually, is that me? She swallowed. Of course it is. It's just not finished. It looks, he hesitated. Strange. Evelyn's breath caught. He had never commented on the portrait before, never hinted that he noticed differences or distortions. Strange how, she whispered. Arthur stepped closer to the canvas, studying his painted face with a furrowed brow. I look older, he said slowly. Sicker. Evelyn's heart thudded painfully. He turned to her then, the sunlight casting a halo of gold across his thinning hair that should not have been thinning at all, not while the bargain held. Evie, he murmured, why would you paint me like that? She opened her mouth, but no sound escaped. Because the portrait shows the truth. Because the bargain was never meant to show the living man, only the dying one. Because the canvas wasn't a painting anymore, it was a confession written in wrought. Before she could form a single word, Arthur's face contorted in a brief wince of pain. His hand flew to his chest. Arthur. Evelyn rushed to him, gripping his forearm. What's wrong? He inhaled sharply, then forced a smile. Nothing. Just a twinge. The lie trembled against his lips like a fragile leaf. Evelyn felt the truth beneath it. She turned toward the painting. The portrait's painted chest now bore a dark bloom beneath the ribs, a shadow shaped like a spreading bruise. And as Evelyn watched, the bruise deepened, its edges feathering out as though rotting flesh drank the light from the room. Arthur, she whispered, lie down. Please. He nodded reluctantly, his breath shivering slightly, and allowed her to guide him to the armchair. But even as he settled into it, Evelyn felt the subtle shift in the air, the room tightening its grip on her spine. She turned slowly. The doorway to the hall stood open, yet she felt as though she had stepped behind an invisible threshold. As if leaving now would tear something vital from her. She approached the door cautiously and reached out a hand. An unseen resistance pressed against her palm, not harsh, not painful, but firm, like the hand of a stern parent guiding a child back to where they belonged. She swallowed. Not yet. The whisper slid through the room like a cold ribbon. She spun, heart lurching. The shadow figure stood near the far window, its silhouette wavering like smoke disturbed by breath. You cannot leave, it whispered. Not while the work remains. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. You said nothing about trapping me here. You are not trapped, the figure murmured. You are tethered to your choice. Evelyn's voice rose, shaking. He's hurting. He was always hurting. But this is wrong. The shadow tilted its head with a soft, curious crackle. Right. Wrong. These are words mortals use to comfort themselves. I told you the price. Evelyn's nails dug into her palms. You said he would live until the painting was finished. And he will. Her stomach twisted. But he's suffering. The figure took a single step forward, its feet not touching the floor, drifting just above it. Of course he is. But you made it sound like the time would be peaceful. The shadow's laugh was a brittle rustle. I promise time. Not grace. Evelyn's breath shuddered. I never wanted him to hurt more. You wanted a masterpiece, the figure replied gently. And masterpieces are never born of joy. Evelyn staggered back, clutching the edge of the table. Stop twisting my words. I twist nothing. The figure drifted toward the portrait. Look at him. Evelyn looked. The painted Arthur had changed again, subtly, but unmistakably. His painted eyes, once warm and gentle, now gleamed with something sharp and mocking, as if aware of the suffering he would soon be forced to endure. His painted mouth curled at one corner, not a smile, but the memory of one, a cruel echo of a tenderness turned rancid. The rot beneath the painted skin had spread down his neck, creeping toward the collar of his shirt like dark vines climbing stone. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand over her mouth. Please, make it stop. The shadow's reply came as a tender whisper. Finish him. Finish the painting, you mean. No, the figure leaned closer, its voice dropping into an intimate, unbearable murmur. Finish him. End the suffering. The brush is your mercy. Evelyn shook her head violently. No. I won't kill him. You already have. She froze. What? Look at him. She turned her gaze to Arthur, the real Arthur, and felt her breath fracture. Though he sat in the armchair, trying to look relaxed, his skin had paled sharply. A faint sweat glossed his forehead. His fingers trembled against the fabric, and a shallow rasp clung to his breaths. He was weakening. Fast. He is dying, the shadow whispered. But you stretched the death long. Longer than he deserved. Longer than he asked for. Evelyn's knees gave way, she sank to the floor. No, 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 the figure's voice softened. All bargains demand honesty, Evelyn. And art demands sacrifice. Her tears splashed onto the wooden floor. I didn't understand. You understood enough to say yes. She looked at the portrait again. Its painted eyes glinted with something like triumph. Like vengeance. Finish it, the figure breathed. And he will pass quietly. Painlessly, if you falter, Evelyn sobbed. He will wither slowly, for days. Weeks, even. Her heart clenched so violently she nearly retched. Finish him, Evelyn. Give him peace. She pressed her forehead to the floor, her breath quivering against the wood. And in that moment she realized something that chilled her deeper than any whisper the shadow had breathed into her. The longer she lived, the longer Arthur would suffer. The painting had become a coffin, and she was the one hammering the nails. She lifted her head slowly, gaze drawn, like a moth to flame, to the portrait once more. The painted Arthur smiled at her. A smile that did not belong to any living man. And Evelyn understood what part 5 must be. For him. And for her. The final evening descended upon the cliffside house with an unnatural stillness, the kind that seems to pause the world mid-breath, leaving even the ocean too stunned to crash against the rocks below. Evelyn could feel the weight of that stillness pressing through the glass walls of the sunroom as she stood before the half-finished portrait, her brush trembling in her hand like a needle in the grip of a fevered seamstress. Arthur lay in the armchair a few feet behind her, breathing in shallow, pained gasps that contradicted the false vitality he had worn for the past 2 weeks. His strength was unraveling now, fraying like a rope that had been pulled too taut for too long. Every breath sounded like it cost him more than the world had left to give. Evelyn knew why. Every stroke she had added had stolen something from him. Every moment she hesitated had prolonged his suffering. And now, as the last smear of twilight faded beyond the glass, the shadow figure appeared once more, no longer lurking in corners, but standing openly beside the portrait, as if its presence here did not need to be negotiated or explained. The hour is late, it whispered. Its voice was softer tonight, almost gentle. He grows tired. Evelyn swallowed hard, clutching the brush until her knuckles whitened. If I stop, if I don't finish, the shadow inclined its head, the faint hum of its form flickering like heat rising from asphalt. Then he lingers, in pain. Between breaths. Between worlds. The bargain fights to resolve itself. Evelyn's voice cracked. I can't choose his death. You already did, the shadow murmured. The moment you sought more time. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears slipping hotly down her cheeks. Arthur made a small sound then, half cough, half gasp. It struck her harder than any scolding, any accusation. Evie, he barely whispered it, but it cut through her like a blade. She turned. Arthur's face, his real face, was tense with quiet agony, though he tried to hide it with a weak smile. Come here a moment, darling, he rasped. She fell to her knees beside him, taking his trembling hands in hers. They were colder than they had been this morning. Arthur, she whispered, I'm so sorry. For what? He murmured, his brow knitting faintly. You've given me the best days I've had in a long time. You don't understand, she choked, voice breaking. What I did, what I agreed to. He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. Evie, stop. She looked up, stunned. Arthur's eyes, though dimmed with suffering, held a clarity she hadn't seen since before the illness began. You made a choice, he whispered. A desperate one. A loving one, even if it came from fear. Tears blurred Evelyn's vision. I only wanted time with you. Arthur lifted a trembling hand to touch her cheek. Then give me peace too. His words struck her with the finality of a closing casket. She bowed her head against his chest, sobbing silently, his heartbeat fluttering beneath her ear like a trapped bird. After a long moment, Arthur exhaled a quiet, shuddering breath. Finish it, he murmured. Let me go while I still remember your face. She lifted her head slowly, brushing tears from her cheeks. I love you, she whispered. I know, he rasped, smiling weakly. That's why I forgive you. Forgiveness. The one gift she never earned. Her heart fractured under the weight of it. The shadow figure drifted closer, not menacing, not triumphant, merely patient. Time, it reminded her softly, moved still. Evelyn rose on unsteady legs, turning back to the portrait. It waited for her like an open grave. The painted Arthur's face had decayed further, the shadows beneath the eyes deeper, the pallor corpse-like, the faint smile unbearable in its cruelty. Colors she hadn't mixed bled through the canvas, forming dark veins that crept beneath the skin. A scent like old earth lingered in the room. The brush felt impossibly heavy now, as if soaked not in paint but in consequence. Evelyn dipped it into a muted, ash-gray tone, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. When she lifted the brush, the shadow leaned nearer. The final strokes, it whispered, are always the quietest. She ignored it. She ignored everything except Arthur's breath behind her. She placed the brush against the canvas and continued where she'd left off, the fold of the collar, the final shaping of the jawline, the tiny nuance of a shadow beneath the ear. Each stroke pulled a faint gasp from Arthur's real body. She heard him, felt him, but forced her hand to keep moving, color after color. Shadow after shadow. The portrait grew heavier in her vision, as though it were slowly expanding, claiming space, consuming the room with its presence. Evelyn's tears fell onto the palette, mixing with the pigment. She didn't wipe them away. She used them, thin, translucent streaks that blended into the lifeless gray of the painted skin. At last, only one detail remained, the eyes. Those gentle, beloved eyes. The painted eyes were nearly finished, only the smallest glint of light was missing. She hesitated. Behind her, Arthur's breathing faltered. Evie, he whispered weakly. Please. Evelyn lifted the brush. Her hand barely shook now. She added the final glint, the faintest catch of light in the painted iris, the detail that would make the portrait whole. The moment the brush left the canvas, Arthur exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied him. A silence followed. A heavy, unnatural silence that swallowed the room whole. Evelyn turned slowly. Arthur's head had fallen to one side, his eyes half closed, his expression peaceful, as though a great weight had finally slipped from his shoulders. He was gone. Her throat tightened as she knelt beside him, resting her forehead against his cold hand. She didn't cry, not because she felt nothing, but because she felt everything, all at once, like grief too vast to fit inside a single human body. Behind her, the shadow sighed with something like satisfaction. It is done. Evelyn rose with hollow steps, turning toward the portrait. And gasped. The painted Arthur, her Arthur, was smiling now. Not cruelly. Not mockingly. But with a deep, knowing tenderness, as though he had stepped into the portrait willingly, consciously, carrying his love with him into the painted world. Arthur, she reached out to touch the portrait, and the door slammed shut. Not from wind. Not from movement. From will. Evelyn spun, rushing to it, but when she grasped the handle, something invisible coiled around her wrist. Not harsh. Not violent. But absolute. Your place is here, the shadow murmured. She shook her head wildly. No, no, the bargain is done, he's gone, you said, the painting is done, it corrected softly. The bargain, Evelyn, is eternal. The invisible force pulled her gently but unyieldingly back toward the canvas. The air thickened around her, as though the room itself were breathing her in. She stumbled back, slamming against the table. Let me go. You created him, the figure whispered. You finished him. Now you must keep him. Evelyn's breath broke. I can't, please, I can't. Every masterpiece, it murmured, requires a witness. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked, the kind of creak that comes from wood shifting under centuries of weight. The portrait glowed faintly, a pulse of painted light drawing her forward. She staggered, resisting, but her body no longer belonged entirely to her. The room tightened its grasp. The walls leaned inward. The windows dimmed to slate. Evelyn reached the easel, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Arthur, she whispered, gazing into the painted eyes. For a heartbeat, just one, she thought she saw them move. Take your place, the shadow whispered, its voice curling around her like smoke. The gallery needs its keeper. Evelyn's knees buckled. She braced herself against the chair. But the room's hold on her did not loosen. She felt it, thread by thread, as it anchored her to the painting, binding her to the final stroke she had made. Please, she whispered. Don't leave me alone. The shadow's reply drifted through the dimming room like a final condition signed in invisible ink. You won't be alone. Not ever again. And the door behind her sealed. Permanently. Later, days, years, decades, she couldn't tell, the villagers would speak of the Hartwell estate as a haunted gallery on the cliff, a place where no light lingered and no visitor ever stayed long. Some claimed to see a woman through the sunroom window, standing before a portrait that never aged, never cracked, never gathered dust. A woman watching. Always watching. The keeper of the painted light. Evelyn Hartwell. Bound to the masterpiece built from her love, and her sin. Story 5. Jane Marlowe had always believed that beauty was a doorway, one that opened only for those who stood perfectly still, smiled perfectly wide, and never let the world see the cracks beneath the paint. She learned early, during her first trembling auditions at 19, that a face could betray you faster than a trembling voice or a missed cue. And so, as the years pressed more insistently into the corners of her eyes and the curve of her jaw, Jane became adept at hiding every flaw, sculpting her image with the devotion of a pilgrim polishing a sacred relic. But at 32, standing under the harsh fluorescence of a casting hallway that smelled of metal and desperation, she felt the door slam quietly in her face. The director barely looked up from his clipboard. You're lovely, he said in a distracted tone, just not luminous. That word burned. Luminous. Like she was a dying bulb. A star dimming. A jewel losing its cut. She walked home through the city that night, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm too sharp for her unsteady breath. Neon signs blurred in the drizzle, rose pink, sickly green, a pale shade of electric blue that reminded her of the old vanity lights in the dressing room she used to share with Olivia Park, an actress who smiled like she had secrets sewn beneath her skin. Olivia had disappeared from the industry years ago. Some said she had married rich. Some whispered she had gone mad. Others claimed she had become too beautiful to film, a phrase that made Jane laugh and ache at the same time. That night, the city felt unfamiliar, as though she were seeing it through a pane of warped glass. Jane kept replaying the director's words, just not luminous, until the syllables began to throb behind her temples. She stopped at a crosswalk, rubbing her eyes, and when she opened them again, the street had changed. At least, it felt like it had. The traffic noise seemed muffled, the lights dimmer, the storefronts rearranged. And there, wedged between a boarded-up laundromat and an abandoned bookstore, stood a building she swore had not been there before, a tall, narrow facade of dark frosted glass, lit by a single red lantern hanging above the door like a drop of fresh blood. The sign was etched directly into the glass in thin silver strokes that curled like strands of hair in water, the midnight aesthetic. Jane felt her breath stutter. The place looked expensive, exclusive, forbidden. Something inside her twisted. Some combination of fear and desire that tasted like hunger. Without thinking, she pressed a hand to the cool metal of the door handle. The moment she touched it, warmth spread through her fingers, unmistakably warm, as though the place had been waiting for her. The door swung inward with a soft hiss. The interior was dim, lit only by a wash of soft gold light that spilled from somewhere deeper inside. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something floral she couldn't place, something ancient, like crushed petals from a flower extinct everywhere but in whispered myths. "Welcome," a voice said, drifting like smoke. Jane startled. A woman stood near the reception counter, her silhouette long and elegant, her white coat gleaming softly in the golden light. Her hair hung straight and black as obsidian, but her face was impossible to read. It seemed to glow faintly from beneath the skin, as though lit by a quiet fire. "We've been expecting you." Jane blinked. Sorry, I didn't have an appointment." "Few do," the woman replied, smiling gently. "Beauty rarely knocks. It wanders in." A strange shiver passed through Jane, not fear, not exactly, but something that tugged at her ribs from the inside. What kind of place is this?" "A correction," the woman said simply. "A restoration. A renewal. A final touch for those whose shine has dimmed." Jane felt the word strike her like a thrown stone. Those whose shine has dimmed. "I don't have much money," she whispered. "You won't need it," the woman replied, tilting her head almost kindly. "What we offer is an exchange." Jane hesitated. "An exchange?" "Not of currency," the woman said. "Of essence." Jane didn't know what that meant, but the room seemed to lean forward, as if waiting for her answer. "I just want to look like myself again," Jane murmured, hating the crack in her voice. "Then you shall." The woman motioned gracefully. "Follow me." Jane stepped deeper into the clinic. The hallway narrowed as she walked, lined with tall mirrors that reflected her from every angle. But the reflections were wrong. Slightly delayed. Slightly distorted. In one, she thought she saw a version of herself with smoother skin, brighter eyes. In another, she swore her reflection whispered something, just a faint breath, a syllable she couldn't make out. Her pulse quickened. "Don't look at the mirrors," the woman advised gently. "They show possibility, not truth." Jane tore her gaze away. The room at the end of the hall resembled an operating suite crossed with an art studio, a reclining chair draped in white linen, jars of creams and powders lined like pigments, brushes and tools neatly arranged as though ready for a sculptor. On a silver tray rested a bowl filled with thick, pale clay that shimmered faintly like moonlit water. "This," the woman said, lifting the bowl reverently, "is the mask." "What's in it?" Jane asked. "Perfection," the woman murmured. "Distilled." She dipped a slender brush into the clay and approached Jane. "Close your eyes." Jane obeyed. The clay touched her skin, cold as river stone, yet comforting in a strange, electric way. It smelled faintly of lilies and something metallic. It spread across her face like liquid porcelain, smoothing into every crevice, tugging gently at the edges of her expression. "Relax," the woman whispered. "Beauty is a surrender." Jane's breath slowed. Her thoughts drifted. The clay thickened, tightening around her features like a second skin. She felt weightless. Floating. When the woman peeled the mask away, it came off in one delicate sheet, thin and translucent as shed snakeskin. Jane inhaled sharply, as though waking from a long sleep. The woman held up a mirror. Jane stared. The skin staring back at her was flawless, radiant, sculpted, luminous. Her cheekbones caught the light like sculpted marble. Her lips looked fuller, her eyes brighter, her jawline sharp enough to cut glass. She looked like the version of herself she used to imagine at 18, hoping, praying, bargaining for one chance to shine. A wet gasp escaped her. "Is this me?" The woman smiled. "The truest version." Jane touched her face, her perfect face, and shivered at the smoothness beneath her fingertips. It felt like her skin. And yet, not. "There is one rule," the woman said, her voice growing softer. "Avoid harsh light. Avoid long stares. Beauty is fragile when new." Jane nodded, barely listening. She was too entranced by the miracle before her. Too desperate to hold this version of herself forever. As she stepped back into the city, the red lantern above the clinic's door flickered briefly, casting a shard of crimson across her flawless cheek. For a moment, just a sliver, Jane heard something faint. A whisper behind her ear. "Quay lie. Quay lie." She spun, heart thudding. But the street behind her was empty. The clinic door had already melted back into darkness, disappearing as though it had never been there at all. Jane lifted her hand to her cheek. Her skin glittered faintly, just for a heartbeat, like the surface of cracked glass catching the moonlight. Then the shimmer vanished. Her breath trembled. "I'm luminous," she whispered to herself. And somewhere in the city's neon heartbeat, something else whispered back. For the first 3 days after her midnight treatment, Jane drifted through the world as though wrapped in a soft golden film, the kind cinematographers used to dream up in the 70s, warm, flattering, blurring every harsh edge of reality until life itself looked like a close-up meant for a movie star who could never age. Wherever she went, heads turned. Conversations paused. Strangers stared openly, some with admiration, some with a curious awe that made her stomach flutter with a mixture of pride and unease. Even in the privacy of her shadowy apartment, Jane caught herself standing before the bathroom mirror for long stretches, marveling at the flawless symmetry of her cheekbones, the gentle upward sweep of her lashes, the way her skin seemed to glow from within like porcelain infused with candlelight. She would run a fingertip along her jawline and feel nothing but smooth perfection, no pores, no subtle imperfections, not even the faint resilience of real flesh. It was like touching a sculpture of herself, a version carved from snow that refused to melt. For 3 days, she believed she had made the right choice. But beauty, as always, demanded attention. And attention demanded exposure. On the 4th evening, Jane attended an industry mixer at a rooftop bar in Silver Lake, eager to be seen by the right people, eager to prove to herself that her transformation wasn't a dream stitched together by exhaustion and longing. The bar shimmered with fairy lights strung like fallen stars, and a soft marine layer haze blunted the harsh glow of the city below. Jane stepped out of the elevator and felt the world freeze for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that happens when someone breathtaking walks into a room. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Faces swiveled toward her like flowers turning toward the sun. Jane smiled, effortlessly, radiantly, and felt a swelling in her chest she had not experienced in years, something dangerously close to hope. A casting director approached her with a champagne flute, his eyes wide with stunned delight. "My God," he breathed, "Jane. You look more luminous than usual," she teased, though her voice shook slightly. "Luminous doesn't cover it," he murmured. "You look unreal." The word prickled against her skin. Yet she accepted the glass and let him lead her into the crowd, where a circle of producers and writers gathered around her, each compliment more extravagant than the last. It should have been intoxicating. It should have been everything she ever wanted. And yet, beneath the praise, beneath the flattery, she heard it. Faint. Almost imagined. A whisper beneath the noise like breath against glass. "Quay lie." Jane stiffened. Her eyes darted around the bar. No one was behind her. No one was whispering. The casting director noticed her sudden stillness. "Everything okay?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Just dizzy." But that wasn't true. She felt something else, something like a tightness spreading beneath her skin, as though the mask she wore were a drum stretched too taut. The lights above her shimmered, and for a moment her reflection in a nearby window flickered. Not her expression, her surface. Her face glimmered faintly, as though made of finely cut crystal catching fragmented bits of light. Jane blinked hard. The shimmer vanished. "Are you sure you're all right?" the casting director asked gently. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine," she insisted, forcing a smile. But her hand trembled around the stem of her glass. She needed a moment alone. She excused herself and slipped into the hallway near the restrooms, where the lighting dimmed enough to ease the tension in her jaw. She splashed cool water on her hands, breathing slowly until her pulse softened. When she finally looked up at the mirror, relief surged through her. Her face looked perfect again. Smooth. Composed. Gleaming in the faint light. She let out a shaky laugh. "You're just tired," she told her reflection. "And you're under bright lights." "It's nothing." But the reflection didn't laugh back. It stared. Too still. Too poised. Too perfect. And then, "Quay Lai." Jane gasped, stumbling back. The voice had come from directly behind her reflection. Yet the room was empty. "Who's there?" Her voice echoed faintly. No response. Just a subtle vibration under her skin, like the feeling one gets when standing too close to a powerful speaker, except the sound came from inside her. She stepped backward, her shoulder blades brushing the tiled wall, her breath ragged. The overhead light flickered once. Twice. On the third flicker, something happened, something small, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make her heart drop. A hairline shimmer, clear and sharp as spider silk, ran across her left cheek, catching the light for a fraction of a second. A crack. A crack in her skin. "No," she whispered fiercely, leaning forward. But when she pressed her fingertips to the spot, the shimmer vanished. The skin felt cold, smooth, untouched. Perfect. The door swung open abruptly, and another actress entered, startled by Jane's pale expression. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," she said. "I just wanted to ask what foundation you use. Your skin looks unreal." There was that word again. Unreal. Jane forced a laugh. "Just a new routine." The actress nodded enviously. "Well, whatever it is, keep doing it. You look incredible." Then she left. Jane stared at herself for another long moment, her breath shallow. Something was wrong. She knew it now. Something in the mask was shifting, reacting, hungry. But she wasn't ready to give up her beauty. Not yet. Back at the party, the casting director introduced her to a producer known for discovering rising stars. The man studied her face with the slow, appreciative gaze of a collector evaluating a perfect specimen. "You're captivating," he said quietly. "I'd like to see you again." Jane's heart leapt. "Really? We're recasting the lead for The Weight of Light. You have the look, purity with an edge. Like you've lived a whole life behind your eyes, but the world hasn't managed to touch your surface. A perfect compliment. A dream offered on a velvet tray." "Can we meet tomorrow morning?" he asked, over coffee. "Bring no makeup. I want to see your real face." Her stomach twisted. No makeup. Under morning light. Harsh light. Something inside her throbbed painfully at the thought. "Quay Lai." Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "Of course." They exchanged numbers. As she walked home, excitement battled with dread inside her chest. She could do this. She would do this. She deserved this chance. But the moment she stepped under the bright LED marquee of a convenience store, her vision blurred. Light hit her face, white, unforgiving, and the whisper erupted like a crack in a dam. "Quay Lai. Quay Lai." Her skin shimmered violently, like a pane of frost struck by a stone. She clutched her face with both hands, stumbling into the shadow of the building. The shimmering stopped. Her breath tore from her chest. "No," she whispered. "Not now. Not tonight." She pressed herself against the cool brick wall, trembling. She felt the mask inside her, silent, shifting, adjusting, like something alive sliding beneath the surface. Something borrowed. Something waiting. "I can handle this," she said aloud, her voice barely more than a frightened whisper. "I can." But deep inside her, buried beneath the flawless sheen, beneath the sculpted lines, beneath the illusion of perfection, something whispered back. "You cannot keep what you did not earn." And Jane realized, with a cold twist in her stomach, that tomorrow's meeting would be a test. And the lights would decide whether she survived it. In the days that followed her strained night at the rooftop bar, Jane found herself swept into a quiet vortex of rising fame, small at first, like the gentle tug of a tide around her ankles, but growing stronger each morning as the calls multiplied, the emails multiplied, the messages multiplied. The producer she met over champagne had indeed followed through, scheduling a coffee meeting in a sunlit cafe in Los Feliz, and although Jane had barely slept the night before, she forced herself out into the morning with sunglasses big enough to hide a third of her face. She was terrified of what the daylight might reveal. But to her relief, and terror, her skin held. The morning light kissed her cheek and her flawless reflection blinked back in the cafe window, pristine as porcelain, unbroken, unmarred. The producer arrived with a script and the kind of smile people reserve for rare discoveries. "You're even more stunning in the morning," he said. Jane's pulse fluttered, but she forced herself to nod casually. "Just lucky lighting." His laugh was soft. "If this is luck, keep it close." Within a week, she had an offer. A starring role. The kind she had once prayed for, the kind she had wept over as younger actresses were handed them without a second glance. Her agent, stunned and suspicious, asked how she had pulled this off. Jane just smiled. The lie rolled easily off her tongue, new skincare routine. Her agent didn't believe her, but the results were too visible to deny. Everyone could see it now, she glowed. She gleamed. She radiated a beauty so pristine it made people stare longer than they realized. And that was the problem. Stares made it worse. The first real incident happened during a table read for The Weight of Light. Jane sat beneath the soft studio overheads, her script open in her lap, surrounded by actors she had once envied and now surpassed. During introductions, each person looked at her, some complimenting her politely, others with a dazed kind of awe, as though staring directly at a solar eclipse. Then came Ian Calloway, an older, respected stage actor known for studying faces with almost obsessive interest. He shook her hand, then froze, still holding it, his eyes locked on hers. "Your bone structure," he murmured, too softly for others to hear. "It's remarkable." Jane pulled her hand back with a nervous laugh. "Lucky genetics." But Ian only stared harder, his eyes narrowing as though trying to peer past the surface of her skin. And then it came, the familiar whisper, low and urgent, somewhere behind her ear. "Quay lie, quay lie." Jane stiffened. Her palms dampened instantly. She tried to break eye contact, but Ian kept looking at her, his gaze unblinking, hungry in a way she didn't recognize. The whisper grew louder. "Quay lai." Jane jerked her head to the floor, pretended she'd dropped her pen, anything to stop the stare. The whisper stopped. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. When she straightened again, Ian was still watching her, but something in his expression had changed, the faintest hint of confusion, maybe even fear, as though he had glimpsed something beneath her beauty that he didn't understand. "Excuse me," Jane murmured quickly, rising from her seat. She rushed to the restroom, slammed the door, and braced herself against the sink. Her reflection stared back with that same impossibly flawless face, but she saw it then. A glint. A shimmer. A faint ripple beneath her cheek, like the surface of a frozen pond flexing under pressure. "Please," she whispered to the mirror. "Not now." She touched her cheek. The ripple vanished. The surface calmed. Her skin looked perfect again, but the dread in her stomach churned. Back in the room, Ian avoided her eyes. And that was its own kind of warning. The mask reacts to being seen. Later that week, paparazzi caught wind of her casting announcement. She stepped out of her apartment into a wall of camera flashes, a bright, strobing storm of artificial daylight. The first flash did nothing. The second made her flinch. The third flash cracked something. She felt it, not on the surface, not on the skin, but under it, like a hairline fracture spreading across a piece of glass under stress. The whisper erupted inside her. "Que lai." She stumbled backward, shielding her face. "Jane. Jane, look this way. Smile for us. You look incredible." But she couldn't. She couldn't look at them. Every flash made the crack widen. She felt it, she knew it, and for a terrible moment she thought her entire cheek might split open like brittle winter ice. Somehow, she pushed through the crowd and ducked into a waiting car. Her driver slammed the door. Silence fell. Jane's hands were shaking violently. She turned to the tinted window and checked her reflection. Perfect. Flawless. Not a single crack. But she could feel it. A weakness in the surface. A seam in the sculpture. Like the face she wore was no longer bonded to the body beneath. "It's fine," she whispered. "You're imagining it." But the whisper replied instantly, curling through her thoughts like a cold finger dragging along the inside of her skull. You borrowed it, give it back." Jane went cold all over. "No," she whispered. "I'm not giving it back. You must not be seen, too long, too close." "I'm an actress," she hissed. "Everyone will see me." "Yes." The whisper exhaled. "They will." That night, she went to another industry event, against her better judgment, but she knew how quickly heat could fade, how suddenly opportunities could cool into indifference. She needed to ride the wave while she could. But something changed the moment she stepped under the ballroom chandeliers. People stared at her with stunned admiration, but beneath the admiration she sensed something darker. Not jealousy. Not desire. Recognition. As though some part of them knew, instinctively, that the face she wore wasn't hers. That it was borrowed. That it belonged somewhere else. And then it happened. The moment that shattered the last thread of denial. A critic, Martin Hale, known for his precision and merciless eye, approached her, smiling politely, then studying her face with an intensity far sharper than flattery. "You're breathtaking," he murmured. "But," Jane's breath stuttered. "But what?" Martin leaned closer. Too close. His gaze sharpened. He kept staring. And staring. And staring. The whisper inside her spiraled into a shriek. "Que lai. Que lai." Her vision blurred. Light warped. The floor seemed to tilt. "Mr. Hale, please," but he didn't stop. He peered at her the way someone peers at a painting they suspect is a forgery, looking for the brushstroke that betrays it. Jane felt the fracture bloom across her skin. Cold. Precise. Unforgiving. Her cheekbone shimmered, a visible crack. Thin as a thread of ice. Martin recoiled. What was that?" Jane stepped back, horrified, pressing both hands to her face. The crack vanished under her fingers. Her perfect skin returned. But something had broken. She could feel it. Deep beneath the surface, the borrowed beauty trembled like a dying star. And for the first time, Jane understood the truth with terrible clarity. The mask wasn't enhancing her. It was replacing her. Slowly. Completely. Permanently. No, she whispered to herself. Not yet. Not yet, please, but the whisper was no longer behind her ear. It was inside her. We are coming back for what is ours. And when Jane looked into the nearest glass pane, she didn't see her own reflection anymore. She saw a face behind hers, pressed against the inside of her skin. Smiling. Waiting. By the time filming for The Weight of Light officially began, Jane had learned to fear the studio the way animals fear thunder, instinctively, involuntarily, with a primal shudder deep in the marrow that no amount of professional polish could hide. The soundstage was a cavern of spotlights, reflective panels, silver rigs and glass surfaces. It was designed to swallow imperfections and amplify beauty, but for Jane it had become a maze of traps. Every reflective surface felt alive. Every spotlight felt like a blade. She moved carefully between marks, pressing the script to her chest like a shield, hoping no one noticed the subtle stiffening of her posture whenever a new light was adjusted or a reflective board was angled her way. In the early morning tests, when the cinematographer asked her to hold still under a set of warm key lights, she felt the whisper ripple beneath her skin, faint at first, then sharper, slicing through her thoughts like a razor across silk. Quay lie. Jane stiffened. The cinematographer noticed. Everything okay? Yes, just, bright, she said, forcing a laugh. But the whisper didn't fade. It grew louder, sharper, stretching beneath her cheekbones like stress fractures. She held her breath as the lights burned against her face. The air seemed to thicken. The room leaned. For a split second she felt it, her skin shifting. A subtle slide, like something underneath adjusting its position. She swallowed hard. Can we break? She whispered. Just for a moment. The cinematographer nodded, calling for a brief pause. Jane fled to the makeup mirror, gripping its edges tightly as she stared at herself. Her flawless reflection blinked back. Too perfect. Too still. Except, the reflection blinked out of sync. Just once. A half-second delay, barely noticeable but undeniably wrong. Jane gasped. The reflection corrected itself, smoothing seamlessly into the illusion of normalcy. But she had seen it. She had seen her, the other her, lag behind, adjusting. Trying to fit. Her breath trembled. Stop, she whispered to the mirror. Stop doing that. The whisper inside her answered. Not us. You. She stumbled backward. Her reflection stayed still for a beat too long. Not following. Watching. Jane covered her face with her hands. Her palms felt the smooth, icy texture she'd grown accustomed to, but beneath the surface, something pulsed. A small, rhythmic vibration. Not a heartbeat. Something else. Something foreign. You are wearing someone, the whisper cooed. And someone is wearing you. Jane whimpered. No, yes. She staggered out of the makeup room, barely breathing. When she reached the hallway, she froze. Olivia Park, the actress who vanished from the industry years ago, stood at the far end of the corridor. Or someone who looked like her. Except Olivia's face was wrong. The skin didn't sit naturally on the bone, it felt stretched, thin, like a balloon inflated just past its limit. And her eyes, oh God, her eyes, shifted beneath the sockets as though trying desperately to stay aligned with each blink. Jane backed up. Impossible. Olivia Park had disappeared. No one knew where she was. No one could find her. Jane, Olivia whispered, her voice a soft rasp, as if pulled across shards of glass. It's you. Jane felt the blood freeze in her veins. Olivia. You took it, Olivia breathed, stepping closer, her movements too fluid, too weightless, as though her joints weren't connected properly. You took the face. Jane stumbled. I didn't know. I didn't know it belonged to someone. It doesn't belong to anyone, Olivia said with a hollow laugh. It belongs to the one who gives it. Who? Olivia's eyes flickered. The one behind the mask. The one who waits. And then Olivia stepped fully under the hallway lights. Jane's breath shattered. Olivia's skin was cracking. Venous fissures ran across her jaw, curling like delicate frost patterns. Thin slices peeled away at the edges, revealing not muscle, not flesh, but something smooth and featureless beneath, like polished stone with veins of light running through it. I didn't go mad, Olivia whispered. I didn't run away. I was returned. Jane fell to her knees. Returned? When the mask finds a better face, Olivia murmured, it moves on. When the world stops admiring you, it comes back. She lifted a trembling hand to her cheek, a piece of her perfect skin flaked off, catching the light like a shard of broken glass before dissolving into a faint mist. You only borrowed it, Jane. You only borrowed the shine. Jane's trembling hands covered her mouth. I don't want this. I don't want to lose my face. Olivia knelt in front of her, eyes soft with pity. You will, she whispered. You'll lose more than that. The overhead light flickered. A crack split down the side of Olivia's temple. A pale glow seeped through it. Run while you still can. But Jane couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. Olivia's face cracked again, this time loudly, like ice breaking on a frozen lake, before her entire left cheek collapsed inward, revealing a hollow cavity of pale luminescent void beneath. Jane screamed. Olivia recoiled, clutching what remained of her face. Go, she rasped. Before it comes for you. Jane staggered to her feet and fled down the hall, the whisper keening in her skull. Que lai. Que lai. She burst into the studio, gasping for air. But the worst was waiting. The director approached her, frowning. Jane. Are you okay? She turned toward him, and his eyes widened in horror. Jane froze. What? What is it? Slowly, he raised a trembling hand. Your face. Jane ran to the nearest panel of glass. Her reflection stared back, and split. A thin crack ran from the corner of her right eye down to her jawline. Delicate. Precise. Inevitable. Her skin glittered faintly, refracting the studio lights like fractured ice. We are taking it back, the whisper crooned. You wore it long enough. Jane's vision blurred with tears. No. No. I'll fix it. I'll fix everything. I'll go back, the whisper hissed. Yes. Come back. And in the reflection, behind her cracking face, she saw her. The creature. The original owner of the beauty. Pressed against the inside of her skin. Waiting. Smiling. Reclaiming. Jane staggered away from the mirror, the crack widening another millimeter with every breath. There was only one place left to go. One place that could undo what she'd stolen. The midnight aesthetic. The red lantern. The whispering door. And whatever waited behind it. She had to go back, but Jane didn't yet understand the final truth. You can return the mask, but the mask might not return you. Jane didn't remember the drive to the midnight aesthetic. She didn't remember navigating the streetlights, or the city blurring around her windshield like streaks of cold neon rain, or her hands shaking so violently the steering wheel trembled beneath her palms. All she remembered was the pain, a thin, shimmering fissure running beneath her skin like a crack across tempered glass, widening each time she exhaled, deepening each time her heart squeezed with the frantic knowledge that her beauty was collapsing, layer by layer, from the inside out. When she finally reached the block where the clinic had once appeared, the street looked ordinary, too ordinary. Dark storefronts. Closed shutters. A dead neon sign flickering above a shuttered bodega. But her face was splitting again, another delicate crack branching from her jawline toward her ear, and the whisper in her skull had become an almost gentle chant, a lullaby spoken backward. Que lai. Que lai. Que, lie. She stepped forward. And only then did she see it. The red lantern. It flickered into existence the way a match flame appears in darkness, sudden, soft, inevitable. The frosted glass building stood where it always had been, yet where it had never been long enough for anyone but her to find it. The sign above the door, the midnight aesthetic, glowed faintly, like silver veins through smoke. Jane pressed her palm to the door. It opened instantly, as though inhaling her. The interior was darker this time. The golden glow had dimmed to a bruised amber, a sickly radiance that pulsed faintly like the dying heartbeat of some slumbering creature beneath the floorboards. The halls were narrow, the mirrors aligned like watching eyes. As Jane passed them, she didn't look, but she could feel them flicker. Hear them. Each reflection whispered her name with the soft hiss of breaking porcelain. Jane. Jane. Jane, tra-lie, tra-lie. She stumbled toward the treatment room. The woman in the white coat stood waiting, though calling her a woman now felt inaccurate. She looked the same at first glance, tall, graceful, hair as dark as obsidian. But when Jane stepped closer, the surface illusion quivered. The woman's skin shimmered like a mirage. Her smile was too still. And her eyes, oh God, her eyes were empty, endless, like looking into the hollow inside of a perfect mask. You came back, the woman said softly, as if greeting a long-lost child. You heard the call. Jane's voice cracked. It's breaking. My face is breaking. Of course it is, the woman murmured, stepping closer with a soft gliding motion that didn't disturb the air. It does not belong to you. Jane staggered back. You said it was my truest self. The woman's smile didn't change, but something in her posture softened, a pitying tilt of the head, the way one might regard a frightened animal. All borrowed things feel true, she whispered. For a time. Jane pressed her shaking fingers to her cheek. Another crack splintered beneath her touch, making a crystalline sound like ice fracturing beneath a winter boot. Please, she choked. Please fix it. I'll do anything. There is nothing to fix, the woman replied gently. Only something to return. The room darkened slightly. The walls seemed to murmur. The mirrors trembled, their surfaces rippling like black water beneath moonlight. Jane's breath hitched. Return it, to who? The woman stepped closer. With every step she took, her face rippled, smooth porcelain flowing like liquid stone, reforming itself with unnatural grace. To the one it belongs to, she whispered. To the one who lent it to you when you asked to be luminous. I didn't ask for this. But you did, the woman said, her voice soft and sad. You asked to be seen. A low hum reverberated through the clinic, vibrating the air. The mirrors on both walls brightened to pale silver. And in each of them, a face appeared. Not Jane's. Not the woman's. Something else. Soft. Featureless. Gleaming like marble smoothed by centuries of tides. Eyes hollow, but reflective, like obsidian pools reflecting the shapes of those who dared look in. The face pressed against the inner surface of the mirrors until the glass bulged outward like skin stretched over bone. Jane screamed. The mirror face whispered. Tra-lie. Jane stumbled backward, clutching her face with both trembling hands. She felt the cracks deepen as her skin shifted, peeling slightly along the fracture lines like thin ceramic preparing to shed. Stop, she sobbed. Please, stop, don't take everything, don't take me. The woman in white reached out with a slow, deliberate motion and touched Jane's cheek with the tip of a single finger. Jane felt the world collapse into silence. Her skin, her perfect skin, shuddered beneath the touch, then began to slide. Not melt. Not tear. Slide. As though her face were a mask made of cool glass, loosening from the bone beneath. Jane screamed again, collapsing to her knees, hands clawing at her cheeks as the flawless surface shifted in one piece, separating from her with horrifying ease. Beneath it, there was no blood. No gore. Just a pale, unfinished terrain, smooth and soft as river stone, marbled with faint veins of milky light. Not a face. A shape waiting to be carved. An identity waiting to be painted. Jane gasped, choking on her sobs. No, 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 what is this? What am I? The whisper answered from everywhere, from the mirrors, from the cracks in her discarded skin, from the hollow beneath her ribcage where fear had rooted deep. You are the vessel. The woman knelt before her, lifting the flawless mask that had once been Jane's face. It shimmered with cold beauty, catching the dim light like a broken shard of godhood. This was never yours, she whispered. Just as it was never Olivia's. Just as she was never the first. Jane shook her head violently, tears streaming down her raw, unfamiliar cheeks. Give it back, she sobbed. Please, please give it back, but you borrowed it, the woman said. And borrowed beauty must be returned. Jane reached out, desperate, her hands trembling violently as she tried to grasp the mask. But the woman pulled it gently away. And the mask, Jane's perfect visage, began to dissolve into pale mist, scattering like powdered frost. Jane let out a strangled cry. No. The mirrors flickered again. Faces, hundreds, appeared in the silvered surfaces. Some complete. Some cracked. Some hollow. Some screaming. And each one whispered the same word, over and over, in a chorus that drowned out Jane's breath. Tra-lie, tra-lie, tra-lie. The woman stood. Go now, she whispered. Your part is done. Jane tried to rise, but her legs gave out. Her body felt heavy, as though her bones were filling with stone. Where do I go? What happens to me? The woman's gaze softened with something like sorrow. You fade, she whispered. As all vessels must. The mirrors brightened, then fractured. A wind rose from nowhere, swirling through the clinic like a cold breath from beneath the earth. Jane felt her skin tremble, her form blur at the edges. Her hands began to lose definition. Fingers dissolving like dust swept by light. No, please, her voice thinned. Broke. Quieted. Her body flickered like a candle in wind. In the glass around her, the other faces watched without blinking, without pity. Without malice. Only inevitability. Jane reached for them. For anyone. For something. But her hand passed through her own reflection. Through herself. Through nothing. She exhaled a sob that never finished. And Jane Marlowe, luminous, lovely, desperate, simply thinned into the air like a story told too late in the night. The woman in white watched the final wisp of her fade, then turned to the mirrors. Next, she whispered. And one of the faces, soft, featureless, patient, stirred. The red lantern flickered once. Twice. Then the clinic vanished from the street. Leaving behind only the faintest shimmer in the air, like the echo of a beauty someone once borrowed, but never truly owned. You made it. Through the mirrors that kept secrets. Through the gardens that fed on sorrow. Through the roots beneath the soil, the shadows in the hallway, and the faces that weren't yours. 5 stories, and not a single scream needed to shake you. Only the quiet. Only the dark. Only the things we pretend not to see when the sun is up. It's almost morning now. Or maybe it only feels that way because the stories have gone silent for a while. Sometimes the most unsettling part of the night is the moment after the last tale ends. When you realize how loudly your room breathes. How gently your walls settle. How familiar shadows look when you're finally paying attention. If any of these stories follow you into your dreams, don't fight them. Nightmares, after all, are just another kind of story. And every story knows to return home eventually. Thank you for staying with me through the long hours. Thank you for listening as the world slept. Wherever you're going now. Back to bed. back to the soft hum of your thoughts, or back into the quiet of a darkened room. I hope you carry a small piece of this night with you. Just enough to remember. Not enough to haunt. Until next time, wanderer of the sleepless. Until the night finds you again. Good night.